Evolutionary Tipping Points. Environmental Priming by Energy Allocation. Author, Rob Coe. The Feedback Mechanism Series, Book 3. Dedication. 4 Open Minds. Quote, "When the environment shifts, it does not merely test life. It sculpts it." Rob Coe, 2026. Introduction. The moment everything changes. Evolution does not usually announce itself with a single dramatic moment. Most of the time, it works quietly, patiently, and almost invisibly. A population shifts slightly. A structure becomes more useful. A developmental pathway is reinforced. A trait that began as a flexible response becomes, over many generations, a more stable feature. For long periods, life appears to remain within familiar boundaries. Species adapt within their existing forms. Shells grow thicker. Beaks sharpen. Camouflage deepens. Bodies become better tuned to the worlds they inhabit. But the history of life is not only a story of slow adjustment. There are moments in Earth's history when the environment changes so deeply, and for so long, that ordinary adaptation is no longer enough. Oceans lose oxygen. Continents shift. Climates reorganize. Food webs collapse. Asteroids strike. The conditions surrounding life do not merely change for one generation. They change for thousands, tens of thousands, or millions of generations. Under those conditions, the signals reaching developing organisms also change. This is the central idea of the feedback mechanism of evolution. Life is not shaped only after birth by survival and selection. It is also shaped before birth, before hatching, and during development, when the organism is still forming and still responsive to the world around it. Fins become limbs. Surface structures become wings. Small mammals, long constrained by the dominance of dinosaurs, radiate into open ecological space. Entirely new ways of living become possible. These are evolutionary tipping points. And they are the subject of this book. That idea, and its implications for the great leaps of evolutionary history, is what this book explores. The series so far. This is the third book in the Feedback Mechanism series. In the first book, The Feedback Mechanism, Darwinism Evolved, I introduced the central idea that evolution is not driven by randomness alone. I proposed the feedback mechanism, or FM, the principle that during the earliest and most sensitive stages of development, gestation in mammals, oogenesis in insects, egg incubation in reptiles and fish, environmental signals act as direct inputs into the developmental process. The world outside the egg helps shape the organism inside it. In the second book, The Feedback Mechanism of Evolution, Key Principles and Case Studies, I developed the 7 core principles of FM. These included the fractal nature of biological complexity, the coevolution of traits, energy allocation, and the role of mitochondria as environmental translators. I then tested those principles against evolutionary puzzles such as the giraffe's neck, the panda's thumb, the blind mole, the giant leaf insect, and the Cambrian explosion. This third book takes the framework further. Here, the questions are not simply how a trait becomes longer, sharper, smaller, stronger, or more refined. The questions are larger. How do entirely new body forms arise? How did legs appear where there were once only fins? How did flight emerge independently in insects, pterosaurs, birds, and bats? How did the Cambrian seas fill with forms that had never existed before? How did mammals, small and mostly nocturnal for more than 160 million years, become the dominant animals of the post-dinosaur world? These are not small adjustments. They are major transitions in the history of life. My argument in this book is that these transitions may be better understood as evolutionary tipping points, moments when environmental priming, mitochondrial response, and energy allocation combine across many generations to redirect development at a deeper level. Scientific positioning. This book presents the feedback mechanism as a theoretical framework, not as established scientific consensus. It draws from accepted areas of biology, developmental plasticity, epigenetics, genetic assimilation, mitochondrial signaling, ecological release, and punctuated equilibrium, but combines them in a way that goes beyond current mainstream evolutionary theory. The aim is not to claim final proof. The aim is to offer a testable model for how environmental signals may help generate coordinated evolutionary change. FM is not presented as a replacement for Darwinian natural selection. Natural selection is real, non-random, and essential. It remains one of the most important ideas in the history of science. What FM questions is not whether selection occurs, but whether the variation selection acts upon is always as random as we have assumed. It asks whether some adaptive variation may be more environmentally responsive, more developmentally coordinated, and more energy-directed than standard models usually allow. In simple terms, natural selection helps explain which organisms survive. The feedback mechanism asks how organisms become developmentally prepared for the environments into which they are born. The structure of this book. Part 1 lays out the theoretical foundation. It revisits the feedback mechanism, defines evolutionary tipping points, introduces the FM cascade as a 5-stage mechanism, and explains how energy allocation and developmental priming may operate at the threshold between adaptation and transformation. Part 2 applies this framework to 4 major transitions: the Cambrian explosion, the movement from water to land, the evolution of flight, and the rise of mammals after the end Cretaceous extinction. Part 3 looks across deep time. It examines why transitional fossils are rare, how priming may become speciation, how mass extinctions create new developmental environments, and why the non-avian dinosaurs may have been both extraordinarily successful and unusually vulnerable. Part 4 reflects on what the tipping point framework means for evolutionary biology as a whole, where it might be tested, and what it suggests about the relationship between life and the world that shapes it. The journey that began with Darwin and Lamarck continues. This book offers one possible new lens: that life does not merely endure its environment. It listens to it, translates it, and sometimes, over deep time, becomes something new. Chapter 1. The Feedback Mechanism Revisited. Quote, "Randomness is only a placeholder we use to describe what we do not yet understand." Rob Coe, 2026. Before we can understand evolutionary tipping points, we need to return to the key mechanism. This chapter is a brief return to the core idea of the feedback mechanism of evolution. For readers who have read the first 2 books, it will serve as a reminder. For readers beginning here, it will provide the foundation needed for everything that follows. The feedback mechanism, or FM, begins with a simple question: what if the environment does not merely select organisms after they are born, but also helps shape them before they are born? Darwinian natural selection explains how organisms better suited to their environment are more likely to survive and reproduce. That remains essential. But selection operates on variation that already exists. FM asks where some of that variation comes from, and whether part of it may be more environmentally responsive than traditional evolutionary models usually allow. The core proposal. The feedback mechanism proposes that during the earliest and most sensitive stages of development, gestation in mammals, oogenesis in insects, egg incubation in reptiles, birds, fish, and amphibians, environmental signals act as direct inputs into the developing organism. At this stage, the organism is not yet fixed in its final form. Developmental pathways are still being chosen. Genes are being switched on and off. Tissues are forming. Organs are being prioritized. Energy is being allocated across the body. The environment reaches this developmental process through many channels: temperature, oxygen levels, diet, chemical exposure, light, stress hormones, physical pressure, seasonal rhythms, and the condition of the parent. These signals do not rewrite the genome. They influence how the genome is read. This is the key distinction. FM does not claim that the environment magically creates new genes. It proposes that the environment helps influence gene expression, developmental priority, and energy allocation. Over one generation, this may produce only a small developmental adjustment. Across many generations, if the same signal persists, the adjustment may become more stable. In this way, the organism is not only selected by its environment. It is, to some degree, prepared by it. The parent lives in a particular environment. That environment affects the parent's physiology. The parent's physiology influences the developing offspring. The offspring is born or hatched already biased toward the conditions it is likely to encounter. If the environment remains stable, the same signals are repeated in the next generation. The same developmental pathways are reinforced. The same traits become more reliable. Established evidence. Environmental effects on development are well documented. Maternal diet can influence offspring metabolism. Stress hormones can cross the placenta and affect fetal brain development. Temperature can determine sex in reptiles such as crocodiles and turtles. Oxygen availability can shape physiological development. Epigenetic marks can influence gene expression without changing the DNA sequence itself. These examples show that development is not sealed off from the world. The developing organism is responsive. FM asks where some adaptive variation comes from, and whether development is more environmentally responsive than standard models usually allow. How mitochondria mediate that responsiveness is the subject of Chapter 4. Chapter 2. What is an evolutionary tipping point? Quote, life does not merely tolerate disruption. At certain moments, it may use it. Rob Coe, 2026. A tipping point is the moment when a system crosses a threshold and begins behaving differently. The change is not necessarily instant. It may have been building for a long time. But once the threshold is crossed, the system no longer continues in the same way. Evolutionary tipping points are moments like this in the history of life. They are not ordinary adaptations. They are not simply cases where a beak becomes slightly shorter, a shell becomes slightly thicker, or an animal becomes slightly better camouflaged. They are moments when life begins to move beyond adjustment within an existing form and toward the construction of something fundamentally new. Fins become limbs. Surface structures become wings. Small, nocturnal mammals become the ancestors of whales, bats, horses, elephants, and primates. The organism does not simply become better at being what it already was. It begins to become something else. Adaptation and transformation. The distinction between adaptation and transformation is central to this book. Ordinary adaptation happens within an existing body plan. A moth's wing darkens. A bird's beak changes shape. A cave fish loses pigment. A mammal living in cold conditions grows denser fur. These changes can be important, but the basic architecture of the organism remains the same. Evolutionary transformation is different. When lobe-finned fish gave rise to the first land vertebrates, the change was not merely a stronger fin or a larger muscle. The internal skeleton of the fin was reorganized. The pectoral girdle changed. The skull changed. A neck appeared. The respiratory system changed. The sensory system changed. The relationship between the body and gravity changed. This was not one trait changing in isolation. It was a coordinated shift across many systems. That is what makes a tipping point different. The 4 signatures of a tipping point. Across the history of life, evolutionary tipping points tend to show 4 recurring features. They are associated with environmental disruption or opportunity. They occur rapidly in geological terms. They involve integrated change across many systems. And once stabilized, they are difficult to reverse. 1. Environmental crisis or opportunity. Major evolutionary transformations do not usually happen in calm, unchanging worlds. They are associated with environmental change. The Cambrian explosion followed profound changes in oxygen, ocean chemistry, and ecological conditions. The movement from water to land occurred in the context of shallow water instability and oxygen stress. The rise of mammals followed the end Cretaceous extinction, when the disappearance of non-avian dinosaurs opened ecological space that had been closed for more than 160 million years. 2. Speed in geological time. Evolutionary tipping points are not instant. This point matters. A major transition may take hundreds of thousands or millions of years. That is slow by human standards. It is not a sudden transformation in the everyday sense. But compared with the long periods of stability that often surround these transitions, the change can be remarkably concentrated. The Cambrian explosion unfolded over a geologically brief interval. The fish-to-land transition occurred within a relatively narrow window of deep time. Mammals diversified rapidly after the end Cretaceous extinction. 3. Integrated change. The most important feature of a tipping point is integration. Large evolutionary transitions require many systems to change together. A limb is not just a bone. It requires joints, muscles, nerves, blood supply, posture, balance, and changes in movement. Flight is not just a wing. It requires aerodynamic surfaces, muscle power, skeletal changes, respiratory changes, sensory changes, and behavioral coordination. 4. Irreversibility. Once a major body plan is stabilized, evolution may continue to modify it, but it rarely returns to exactly what came before. Tetrapods did not simply go back to being fish after limbs evolved. Birds did not return to non-feathered reptilian forms after flight-capable feathered lineages emerged. Mammals did not abandon the deep developmental features that made them mammals once those features had stabilized. This does not mean evolution cannot reverse traits. It can. Structures can shrink. Functions can be lost. Lineages can return to water, as whales did. But they do so by modifying the body plan they already have, not by rewinding history. A whale is not a fish. It is a mammal returning to the water through a mammalian body plan. That is the point. Evolution moves forward by transforming what already exists. Once a tipping point has created a new developmental architecture, future evolution works from that architecture. Tipping points and punctuated equilibrium. The idea of evolutionary tipping points connects naturally with punctuated equilibrium. Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldridge argued that the fossil record often shows long periods of relative stability interrupted by shorter periods of rapid change. They did not deny Darwinian evolution. They challenged the assumption that evolutionary change must always be slow, smooth, and continuous. Punctuated equilibrium describes a pattern. That is the FM tipping point. Not a miracle. Not an instant leap. Not a rejection of natural selection. A long, directional, developmental process that becomes visible in the fossil record as concentrated change. Chapter 3. The FM Cascade, a new framework. Quote, "Evolution is not random noise. It is signal, amplified across generations." Rob Coe, 2026. If the feedback mechanism explains how the environment influences development, then we need a way to describe what happens when that influence becomes strong enough to produce major evolutionary change. For this, I use the term FM cascade. A cascade is a sequence of linked events. One stage enables the next. A small trigger, if repeated or amplified, can eventually produce a much larger outcome. In biology, cascades are everywhere: hormonal cascades, immune cascades, genetic regulatory cascades, developmental cascades. The FM cascade is my proposed framework for how sustained environmental change may redirect development across generations until a lineage crosses an evolutionary threshold. It is not a single mutation. It is not one dramatic leap. It is not a sudden transformation. It is a process. The FM cascade has 5 stages: environmental shift, intensified priming signal, energy reallocation, generational reinforcement, and new body plan stabilization. Together, these stages describe how environmental pressure may move from the outside world into the developing organism, then from development into heredity, and finally from heredity into evolutionary form. Stage 1. Environmental shift. The cascade begins when the environment changes. This may be a change in oxygen levels, temperature, ocean chemistry, food availability, predator pressure, light, habitat structure, or ecological competition. It may happen gradually through climate change or geological movement. It may happen more sharply through volcanic activity, ocean anoxia, or asteroid impact. What matters is not only that the environment changes. What matters is that the change is strong enough, persistent enough, and biologically relevant enough to alter the developmental conditions experienced by organisms across many generations. A brief disruption may kill many individuals, but it does not necessarily create a new evolutionary direction. A long disruption does something different. It changes the world into which each generation is born. It changes the signals that reach embryos, eggs, larvae, and developing offspring. In FM terms, the environment has begun to speak in a new language. Stage 2. Intensified priming signal. The second stage is the change in developmental priming. A parent living in a changed environment carries that environment into reproduction. Its body reflects the conditions it has experienced: nutrition, stress, oxygen, temperature, toxins, light cycles, disease burden, and energy availability. These conditions influence the developing offspring. The signal may pass through hormones, nutrients, inflammatory markers, metabolic state, mitochondrial activity, epigenetic marks, or the conditions surrounding an egg. In mammals, the maternal body is the immediate environment of the embryo. In egg-laying animals, the egg itself carries information from the parent, while the surrounding environment adds further signals during incubation. In stable times, the priming signal usually fine-tunes development within an existing form. But at a tipping point, the signal becomes more intense and more coherent. Several environmental channels begin pointing in the same direction at once. Low oxygen, changing water chemistry, new food sources, altered light, new physical pressures, and parental stress may all converge. The developing organism is not receiving one weak signal. It is receiving a pattern. And repeated across generations, that pattern matters. Stage 3. Energy reallocation. The third stage is the core of the FM cascade, energy reallocation. Development is not just a genetic script unfolding automatically. It is also an energetic process. Building a body requires choices. Energy must be directed somewhere. Tissues must be prioritized. Some structures receive more investment, others receive less. This is where mitochondria become central. Mitochondria respond directly to the conditions of life: oxygen, nutrients, temperature, stress, toxins, and energy demand. They help determine how much energy is available to the cell, how that energy is produced, and how cellular metabolism interacts with gene expression. In the FM framework, mitochondria act as environmental translators. They help convert external conditions into internal developmental priorities. If the environment repeatedly signals that certain structures will be useful, energy may be directed toward those structures. If the environment repeatedly signals that other structures are costly or less useful, energy may be withdrawn from them. Over one generation, this may produce only a small change. Across many generations, the same direction of energy allocation may become increasingly important. A fin becomes more load-bearing. A surface structure becomes more aerodynamic. A sensory system becomes more refined. A digestive system becomes better suited to a new diet. A brain becomes more flexible in a newly complex environment. The important point is that energy reallocation does not act on isolated traits alone. Development works through integrated systems. When energy shifts during development, it may influence whole networks of tissue, structure, metabolism, and behavior. This is how FM begins to explain coordination. Stage 4. Generational reinforcement. A single generation does not make an evolutionary transformation. The feedback mechanism depends on repetition. If the environmental signal disappears, the developmental response may fade. But if the signal remains, the response is reinforced. Each generation is primed in a similar direction. Each generation expresses the response a little more reliably. Natural selection then acts on the results, preserving the variants that function best in the changed environment. Over time, flexible responses can become more stable. This process is related to what biologists call genetic assimilation. A trait that originally appears as a plastic response to environmental conditions can, under repeated selection, become genetically stabilized. FM extends this idea into a broader evolutionary framework. It proposes that repeated environmental priming, mitochondrial response, energy allocation, epigenetic change, and selection may work together across many generations. The result is not instant change. It is cumulative change. The environment signals. Development responds. Selection tests. Inheritance stabilizes. The process repeats. This is the cascade. Stage 5. New body plan stabilization. The final stage is stabilization. At this point, the new developmental pattern no longer depends entirely on the original environmental trigger. The response has become built into the lineage. It is now part of the organism's normal developmental program. This is when an evolutionary tipping point has truly been crossed. The organism has not merely adjusted within its old form. It has acquired a new developmental architecture. Future evolution will now work from that architecture. This is why major transitions are so important. Once a lineage crosses one of these thresholds, it does not simply return to the previous state. It may continue to adapt. It may diversify. It may even return to old environments in new ways. But it does so from the new body plan. A whale returns to the water, but it does so as a mammal. A bird takes to the air, but it does so through a dinosaurian body transformed by feathers, wings, and respiratory changes. A tetrapod may become aquatic again, but it carries the history of limbs, lungs, and terrestrial ancestry within its body. Evolution does not erase its past. It transforms it. FM interpretation. The FM cascade is a theoretical proposal. Its 5 stages draw on real biological processes: developmental plasticity, epigenetic regulation, mitochondrial signaling, energy metabolism, genetic assimilation, and natural selection. Each of these exists within modern biology. The larger claim of this book is that, under certain conditions, these processes may combine into a directional evolutionary cascade powerful enough to help produce major transitions in form. That claim goes beyond current consensus. It is not presented here as final proof, but as a framework that may help explain why the fossil record often shows long periods of stability interrupted by concentrated periods of transformation. Open question. The key open question is the threshold itself. What exactly changes when ordinary developmental plasticity becomes evolutionary transformation? At what point does a flexible response become a stable developmental bias? At what point does a stable developmental bias become genetically assimilated? At what point does a population become so developmentally distinct that it is no longer the same kind of organism as its ancestor? These are questions that can, in principle, be tested. If FM is correct, then major evolutionary transitions should show signs of coordinated developmental change, not just isolated trait change. They should be associated with strong environmental disruption, altered energy availability, mitochondrial stress or opportunity, and repeated developmental signals across generations. That is what the case studies in this book will examine. Chapter 4. Energy Allocation as the Engine of Form. Quote, "The universe prefers efficiency. Life does not merely follow this principle, it was built by it." Rob Coe, 2026. Of all the principles introduced in the second book, energy allocation may be the most important for understanding evolutionary tipping points. A body is not built from information alone. It is built from energy. Genes provide instructions. Development provides timing. The environment provides signals. But none of this matters unless energy is available to build tissues, organs, muscles, nerves, bones, membranes, skin, feathers, lungs, eyes, and brains. Every form has a cost. A larger brain costs energy. A stronger limb costs energy. A thicker shell costs energy. Flight costs energy. Pregnancy costs energy. Warm-bloodedness costs energy. Vision costs energy. Even maintaining a structure that is no longer useful costs energy. Life is therefore constantly making energetic decisions. Not consciously, of course, but development itself is a process of allocation. Energy flows towards some structures and away from others. Some tissues are prioritized. Others are reduced. Some systems are expanded. Others are suppressed. The shape of an organism is, in part, a record of where energy has been invested. The principle of efficient form. In physics, natural systems often follow efficient paths. Rivers follow gradients. Light bends according to paths of least time. Physical systems tend toward arrangements that reduce unnecessary expenditure. An organism must build itself within energetic limits. It must survive within energetic limits. It must reproduce within energetic limits. A structure that gives no benefit is costly. A structure that improves survival or reproduction may justify its cost. A structure that becomes essential may attract more developmental investment over time. This is one reason evolution often appears economical. Unused eyes shrink in cave animals. Limbs reduce in snakes. Wings are lost in some island birds. Pigment disappears where it no longer serves a purpose. But energy allocation is not only about loss. It is also about construction. When the environment makes a structure valuable, development may begin investing more energy in that structure. A limb becomes stronger. A jaw becomes more powerful. A lung becomes more useful. A sensory organ becomes more refined. This is where energy allocation becomes an engine of form. Development is an energy budget. During development, the organism is building itself. Cells divide. Tissues specialize. Organs form. Bones mineralize. Muscles grow. Nerves connect. Hormonal systems organize. The immune system develops. The brain expands. All of this requires energy. But the developing organism does not have unlimited energy. It must allocate energy according to inherited developmental programs and the signals it receives. Which systems are built first, and which are deferred, depends on the signals the developing organism receives. Those signals are environmental. Established evidence. The developmental effects of energy allocation are measurable. Maternal nutrition can affect offspring metabolism and organ development. Oxygen availability can influence blood, lung, and cardiovascular development. Stress can alter endocrine and neurological development. Temperature can alter developmental pathways in many organisms. These examples show that development is energy-sensitive and environment-sensitive. They do not prove the full FM framework, but they show that the basic biological foundation is real. Development responds to the energetic conditions under which it occurs. Mitochondria and the allocation of possibility. Mitochondria are central because they control much of the energy economy of the cell. They do not merely produce energy in a mechanical way. They respond. They adjust. They signal. When oxygen changes, mitochondrial output changes. When nutrients change, mitochondrial metabolism changes. When stress changes, mitochondrial signaling changes. When energy demand changes, mitochondrial behavior changes. These changes influence the biochemical environment of the cell. They affect gene expression, epigenetic marking, reactive oxygen signaling, and the availability of molecules used in developmental regulation. In this sense, mitochondria do not simply power development. They help interpret the conditions under which development occurs. That interpretation may be one of the key ways the environment enters evolution. Latent developmental programs. A key idea in this book is that organisms contain more developmental possibility than they express. A genome is not a single rigid blueprint. It is more like a library of possible instructions, with only some sections read in any given form of life. Some fish carry developmental pathways related to limb-like structures. Snakes retain traces of limb-building programs. Cave fish can reveal eye development potential under certain genetic combinations. Birds retain dinosaurian developmental history. Mammals carry deep ancestral possibilities that can be modified in new environments. This does not mean anything can become anything. Development is constrained. History matters. Body plans matter. Evolution works with what already exists. But what already exists often contains hidden potential. FM proposes that environmental priming and energy allocation may help determine which parts of that potential become expressed. At a tipping point, the environment does not create a new body from nothing. It changes the conditions under which latent developmental possibilities are activated, expanded, or stabilized. This is why major evolutionary transitions are both new and familiar. A limb is new, but it grows from a fin-like foundation. A wing is new, but it grows from an existing surface, limb, or appendage. A whale is aquatic, but it remains a mammal. A bird flies, but it carries dinosaur ancestry in its bones. Evolution does not invent from emptiness. It reworks what is already there. The fractal principle and new form. In the second book, I described the fractal nature of biological complexity, the tendency of life to build larger forms by repeating and modifying smaller patterns. This matters for energy allocation because development rarely invents entirely new organizational principles. It repeats, modifies, expands, and redirects existing ones. Blood vessels branch. Nerves branch. Lungs branch. Limbs repeat patterns of one bone, two bones, many smaller bones. Feathers repeat branching structures. Leaves repeat branching veins. Biological complexity often grows through variation on a pattern. At a tipping point, energy allocation may redirect these repeating patterns into new forms. The fin skeleton becomes the limb skeleton. The scale-like or filament-like structure becomes the feather. The grasping hand becomes the bat wing. The mammalian body returns to the sea as the whale. The new form is not arbitrary. It is shaped by ancestry, constrained by development, tested by selection, and guided by energy. Why energy allocation matters for tipping points. Evolutionary tipping points require coordination. They require more than one trait changing at a time. A new body plan demands that many systems shift together: skeleton, muscle, nerves, blood supply, metabolism, behavior, reproduction, and sensory processing. Energy allocation provides a way to think about that coordination. If the developmental energy budget shifts, it can affect whole systems rather than isolated parts. It can change priorities across the organism. It can make some pathways more likely and others less likely. Chapter 5. The priming threshold, when feedback tips. Quote, "Not all feedback changes the organism, but some feedback changes its nature." Rob Coe, 2026. The feedback mechanism does not mean that every environmental signal produces evolutionary change. Most signals do not. A cold season may alter survival. A dry year may reduce reproduction. A temporary food shortage may affect development for one generation. But if the environment returns to normal, the developmental signal also returns to normal. The organism adjusts, but the lineage does not necessarily change direction. For the feedback mechanism to produce an evolutionary tipping point, something more is required. The signal must cross a threshold. The priming threshold is the point at which ordinary environmental feedback becomes powerful enough to redirect development in a sustained way. Below the threshold, the organism adapts within its existing form. Above the threshold, development may begin moving toward a deeper transformation. Not every disruption crosses this threshold. Most do not. Life is buffered against noise. Development is not fragile. Organisms must be able to survive ordinary variation without rebuilding themselves every generation. But under certain conditions, the signal becomes too strong, too consistent, and too convergent to ignore. That is when feedback tips. Signal intensity. The first requirement is intensity. A weak environmental signal produces a weak developmental response. A slight temperature change, a short period of stress, or a brief change in diet may alter development slightly, but it is unlikely to redirect a lineage. Developmental systems are buffered. They are designed, through evolution, to produce a functioning organism despite ordinary environmental variation. This buffering is essential. Without it, life would be too unstable. But there are moments when the signal becomes stronger than the buffer. Oxygen drops sharply. Temperature shifts beyond normal limits. Food webs collapse. Predators disappear or new predators appear. Habitats change in structure. Light, chemistry, pressure, and available energy all shift. At that point, the developing organism receives more than background variation. It receives a new developmental environment. The signal has become intense enough to matter. This does not mean that a single strong signal creates a new species. It means that the first condition for a tipping point has been met. The environment has changed with enough force to alter the developmental conversation. Signal consistency. Intensity alone is not enough. A signal must also persist. A single generation of environmental pressure may produce developmental change, but evolutionary transformation requires repetition. The signal must be present again and again. Generation after generation, embryos, eggs, larvae, or developing offspring must experience the same directional pressure. Only then can the response become reinforced. At first, the response may be plastic and reversible. Later, it may become more stable. Epigenetic marks may become more reliably re-established. Developmental pathways may become easier to activate. Natural selection may preserve individuals in which the response functions better. Over many generations, what began as a flexible adjustment may become a developmental tendency. Over still longer spans, that tendency may become genetically assimilated. This is why absolute time matters. A laboratory experiment using fast-breeding organisms may compress generations, but it does not necessarily reproduce the full duration of environmental persistence that major evolutionary change requires. Thousands of generations matter, but so does the wider continuity of the world those generations inhabit. A decade of unusual cold may be a crisis. 1,000 years of cooling may be a signal. 1,000,000 years of altered climate may be an evolutionary environment. The FM cascade requires consistency. Without it, the signal fades. Absolute time. Why generations alone are not enough. There is one further point about signal consistency that matters deeply. Evolutionary time is not only the number of generations that pass. It is also the amount of actual time during which an environment remains present, stable enough, and biologically meaningful enough to shape development. I call this absolute time. Many evolutionary experiments use organisms with very short lifespans, such as bacteria or fruit flies. These organisms can pass through thousands of generations in a short period, which makes them valuable for studying adaptation, mutation, selection, and rapid biological response. Generations matter. But generations alone are not evolutionary time. Signal convergence. The third requirement is convergence. A single environmental signal may push development in one direction. But major evolutionary transitions usually require many systems to change together. That kind of coordination is more likely when multiple environmental signals point in the same direction at the same time. This is signal convergence. An ocean that loses oxygen may also change in temperature, acidity, nutrient flow, and biological competition. A land environment opened after extinction may change food availability, predator pressure, light exposure, social behavior, and habitat structure. A shallow water habitat may combine low oxygen, physical contact with substrate, greater temperature variation, and exposure to air. Each signal matters on its own. But together, they create a pattern. The developing organism is not receiving one isolated message. It is receiving a repeated environmental theme. This is where mitochondria again become important. Mitochondria respond to many of these signals simultaneously: oxygen, nutrients, stress, temperature, and energy demand. They do not translate one environmental variable in isolation. They integrate multiple conditions into the cell's energy economy. If several environmental channels converge, mitochondrial behavior may shift in a more coherent way. Energy production changes. Metabolic signaling changes. Epigenetic substrates change. Developmental priorities change. In FM terms, convergence gives the signal direction. Intensity gives the signal force. Consistency gives it duration. Convergence gives it coherence. When all three are present, the priming threshold becomes reachable. Developmental inertia. To understand the priming threshold, we also need to understand what it must overcome. Every organism inherits a developmental program that has already been stabilized by its ancestry. A fish develops as a fish. A reptile develops as a reptile. A mammal develops as a mammal. This seems obvious, but it matters deeply. Development has inertia. The organism does not begin from zero. It begins from a history. Genes, regulatory networks, tissue relationships, body axes, timing sequences, and energy priorities have already been shaped by millions of years of evolution. This inherited stability is what makes organisms reliable. It is why offspring resemble parents. It is why a lineage can persist through ordinary environmental variation without losing its form. But it also means that a major evolutionary transition requires more than a small push. The existing body plan resists deep change. Not consciously, but structurally. Its developmental pathways are canalized. Its systems are integrated. Its energy priorities are established. The priming threshold is the point at which environmental signals become powerful enough to overcome that developmental inertia. Below the threshold, the organism adjusts. Above the threshold, the developmental program begins to reorganize. When feedback tips, the priming threshold is therefore not one thing. It is the meeting point of several conditions. The environmental signal is intense enough to affect development. The signal persists across many generations. Multiple signals converge in the same direction. The organism's developmental system is responsive enough to shift, and the population structure allows the response to stabilize. This is not a rejection of natural selection. Selection remains essential. Many primed variations will fail. Many lineages will disappear. Many responses will not work. But FM proposes that before selection filters the result, development has already been biased by the environment. The world outside the organism has entered the process of form building. At ordinary times, this produces adaptation within the existing body plan. At tipping points, it may begin to produce transformation. That is why the next chapters turn from theory to history. If the FM cascade is a useful framework, it should help us make sense of the great transitions in the fossil record: the Cambrian explosion, the movement from water to land, the origin of flight, and the rise of mammals after the asteroid. These are the places where feedback may have tipped. Chapter 6. The Cambrian explosion, the great tipping point. Quote, "In a brief window of geological time, the seas filled with forms that had never existed before. The FM framework asks, what signal was strong enough to produce this?" Rob Coe, 2026. The Cambrian explosion is one of the most important events in the history of life. Around 541 million years ago, the fossil record changed dramatically. 4 billion years before this, life had been mostly microbial, simple, soft-bodied, and difficult to see in stone. Then, in a relatively short span of geological time, the oceans began to fill with animals that looked far more complex. Bodies with shells. Bodies with segments. Bodies with eyes. Bodies with limbs, spines, mouths, guts, and skeletons. Predators. Prey. Burrowers. Swimmers. Crawlers. Many of the major animal body plans recognized today trace their origins to this period. Darwin saw the Cambrian explosion as a serious challenge. If evolution moves only by the slow accumulation of tiny variations, why did so much animal complexity appear so suddenly in the fossil record? Modern biology has many answers: earlier soft-bodied ancestors, changes in oxygen, ecological arms races, developmental gene networks, mineral availability, and the incompleteness of the fossil record. The FM framework does not reject these explanations. It asks how they might fit together. From the perspective of the feedback mechanism, the Cambrian explosion may represent the first great evolutionary tipping point, a moment when environmental change, energy availability, developmental possibility, and selection converged. The world before the Cambrian. Before the Cambrian, the Earth had already been alive for billions of years. Life was not absent. It was everywhere at the microbial scale. But complex animal bodies were limited. Large, active, hard-bodied animals require energy. They require oxygen. They require materials. They require developmental programs capable of building tissues in coordinated ways. The world before the Cambrian may not yet have provided the right combination. Then the environment changed. The Cambrian followed a period of extraordinary planetary disruption, including the extreme glaciations often referred to as Snowball Earth. As the planet recovered, oceans thawed, minerals were released, nutrient flows changed, oxygen levels rose, and light conditions shifted. The world into which early animals developed was no longer the same world their ancestors had inhabited. Established evidence. The Cambrian explosion followed major changes in Earth's environment. Oxygen levels rose through the late Precambrian and early Cambrian. Oceans became chemically different. Mineral availability increased. The earliest mineralized skeletons appear near the base of the Cambrian. Fossils from this period show a rapid increase in animal diversity, ecological complexity, predation, movement, and bodoplan experimentation. These facts are broadly accepted. There is also broad agreement that the Cambrian explosion was not caused by one factor alone. It likely involved several interacting processes: oxygenation, ecological competition, developmental genetic capacity, environmental chemistry, and preservation bias. The Cambrian is powerful because many signals appear to have converged. Oxygen and the energy threshold. The most important Cambrian signal may have been oxygen. Oxygen matters because complex animal life is expensive. Muscles require energy. Nervous systems require energy. Active movement requires energy. Predation requires energy. Building and maintaining large bodies requires energy. Mitochondria use oxygen to produce ATP, the energy currency of the cell. When oxygen is limited, energy production is constrained. When oxygen becomes more available, new developmental possibilities open. This is where the Cambrian becomes central to the FM framework. The rise in oxygen did not simply allow animals to survive. It may have changed what developing organisms could afford to build. In an oxygen-poor world, a skeleton may be too costly. A complex nervous system may be too costly. Active predation may be too costly. Large body size may be too costly. In an oxygen-richer world, these structures become more energetically possible. The same genome, or the same ancestral developmental toolkit, may behave differently when the energy budget changes. In FM terms, oxygen altered the developmental economy. More energy meant more possibility. Programs that were too expensive to run could become viable. Tissues that were too costly to build could receive greater investment. Structures that had previously remained limited could expand. This may help explain why the Cambrian was not merely an increase in species number, but an expansion in form. The animals of the Cambrian did not simply become more numerous. They became more architecturally varied. From an FM perspective, that suggests a shift in developmental possibility itself. Minerals, skeletons, and hard parts. Oxygen was not the only signal. The post-glacial oceans also carried minerals that mattered for building hard structures. Calcium, phosphorus, silica, and other materials used in shells, spines, plates, and skeletons. A skeleton is not only a genetic possibility. It is also a chemical and energetic investment. The organism must have access to the materials, and it must be able to afford the cost of using them. The Cambrian oceans provided both. Mineral availability supplied the raw materials. Oxygen supplied the energy. Ecological pressure supplied the reason. Once some animals developed hard parts, others faced new pressures. Predators became more effective. Prey needed defense. Burrowing changed the seafloor. Movement became more important. Vision became more valuable. This created an arms race. In standard evolutionary terms, this arms race intensified selection, and in FM terms, it also intensified the developmental signal. The environment was now telling organisms, generation after generation, that armor, movement, sensation, and predation mattered. Light, eyes, and the new visual world. Another important Cambrian change was the growing importance of light. As oceans changed, light penetration and visual environments became increasingly significant. Eyes are among the most striking innovations associated with the Cambrian world. Once organisms can see, the entire ecological landscape changes. Predators can track prey. Prey can detect predators. Movement becomes more strategic. Camouflage becomes more useful. Body shape becomes part of visual survival. Vision is expensive. Eyes require specialized tissues, neural processing, and behavioral coordination. But in a world where light becomes biologically useful, the return on that energy investment becomes high. The FM framework interprets this as another convergent signal. Oxygen made energy available. Minerals made hard structures possible. Light made vision valuable. Predation made defense and movement urgent. Together, these signals point in the same direction, toward larger, more active, more structured, more responsive animals. That is exactly the kind of convergence the FM cascade predicts. Why so many forms? The Cambrian explosion is not only remarkable because animals became more complex. It is remarkable because so many different forms appeared. FM offers one way to think about this. When a major environmental threshold is crossed, it does not produce the same response in every lineage. Different organisms carry different developmental histories. They have different latent programs, different constraints, different body axes, different tissues, and different starting points. The same environmental opportunity can therefore produce many different solutions. One lineage builds a shell. Another builds jointed limbs. Another builds a burrowing body. Another builds a swimming form. Another builds better eyes. Another builds spines. The signal is shared. The response is lineage-specific. This is one reason the Cambrian explosion may have produced such diversity. The environment did not prescribe one body plan. It opened the energetic and developmental space in which many body plans could be tested. Why no comparable explosion since? A natural question follows. If the feedback mechanism can produce such dramatic transformation, why has there not been another Cambrian explosion? The answer may be that the Cambrian combined conditions that have not been repeated in the same way. It occurred in a world where complex animal ecosystems were still young. Many ecological roles were unoccupied. Developmental possibilities were not yet locked into the major animal architectures we know today. Oxygen, minerals, light, and ecological interaction were shifting together. Later environmental disruptions were dramatic, but they occurred in worlds already filled with established animals. Existing body plans had already stabilized. Ecological networks were already complex. Developmental pathways were already more deeply canalized. After the Cambrian, evolution continued to innovate, but largely within the body plans that had already emerged. This does not make later evolution less impressive. Fish, amphibians, reptiles, dinosaurs, birds, mammals, whales, bats, and humans all came later. But they came as transformations within the great architectural possibilities opened in the Cambrian. The Cambrian may have been the first great tipping point because it crossed a threshold not merely of species, but of developmental possibility. Open question. The Cambrian explosion remains one of the deepest questions in evolutionary biology. The FM interpretation is not that mitochondria, oxygen, or energy allocation alone explain it. Rather, FM proposes that rising oxygen and changing environmental conditions may have altered the developmental energy economy in ways that allowed latent biological possibilities to become expressible. The key open question is molecular and developmental. How exactly did changing oxygen levels, mitochondrial output, mineral availability, and ecological pressure alter gene regulation and developmental pathways in early animals? If that pathway can be clarified, the Cambrian explosion may come to look less like a sudden mystery and more like the first great example of environmental priming through energy allocation. Chapter 7. From Water to Land. The Fish That Grew Limbs. Quote, "The first creature to pull itself onto land was not being brave. It was following signals that had been accumulating in its lineage for millions of years." Rob Coe, 2026. The movement from water to land is one of the great transitions in the history of life. It is easy to picture it as a single dramatic moment, a fish dragging itself onto a muddy bank, crossing the boundary between two worlds. But that image is misleading. The transition from water to land was not one animal making one heroic escape. It was a long developmental and evolutionary process. It unfolded across many generations, in shallow environments where water, mud, plants, air, oxygen stress, and physical contact with the ground all met. The first land vertebrates did not come from ordinary fish. They came from lobe-finned fish, animals that already carried within their bodies some of the developmental possibilities that later became limbs. Their fins contained internal bones arranged in ways that foreshadowed the tetrapod limb. Some possessed primitive lungs or air-breathing capacity. They were not land animals yet, but they were not simply open-water swimmers either. They were already living near a threshold. This chapter asks how that threshold may have been crossed. The Devonian world. The fish-to-land transition occurred during the Devonian period, roughly 375 million years ago. This was a world of changing coastlines, expanding plant life, shallow waters, and unstable aquatic environments. Forests were beginning to transform the land. Root systems altered soils and water flow. Organic material entered shallow waters. Decomposition consumed oxygen. Many coastal and freshwater environments became low in dissolved oxygen. For fish living in these habitats, this mattered deeply. Gills work well when oxygen is available in water. But in warm, stagnant, oxygen-poor shallows, gills are less reliable. In such conditions, any organism that could supplement gill breathing with air breathing had an advantage. The water itself was no longer a stable refuge. It became a mixed environment, sometimes aquatic, sometimes exposed, sometimes oxygen-poor, sometimes filled with plants, mud, obstacles, and shallow pools. The boundary between water and land was not a line. It was a zone. And it was in this zone that the first steps toward tetrapod life occurred. Established evidence. The fossil record gives us remarkable evidence for this transition. Tiktaalik rosei, discovered in the Canadian Arctic in 2004, is one of the most famous examples. It had fish-like features, but also traits associated with early land vertebrates. Its skull could move more independently from the shoulder region. Its fins contained bones suggestive of wrists. Its body was suited to shallow water environments where pushing, propping, and maneuvering against substrate would have mattered. Tiktaalik is not half fish and half amphibian in a simplistic sense. It is better understood as a transitional form showing that the move toward land involved a gradual reworking of existing structures. The evidence also shows that early tetrapod evolution was not about one trait. It involved the skull, neck, limbs, ribs, lungs, sensory systems, posture, and movement. The body was being reorganized as a system. That is why this transition is so important for the FM framework. It shows coordinated change. The FM interpretation, a whole-body signal. The feedback mechanism does not interpret the fish-to-land transition as a single mutation that produced limbs. It interprets it as a whole-body developmental response to a changing environment, refined by selection over many generations. The signal was not simply grow a limb. The signal was broader. Survive in shallow, oxygen-poor water. Push against mud and plants. Use air when water fails. Support the body in a different medium. And move through an environment where swimming alone is no longer enough. Those signals reach developing organisms through oxygen levels, temperature, water chemistry, physical pressure, parental condition, and the environment surrounding eggs. In FM terms, the organism was not responding to one cue. It was responding to an entire ecological situation. This is why the transition required systemic change. The environment was not demanding a better fin in isolation. It was demanding a new relationship between body, gravity, air, and ground. Oxygen, mitochondria, and the pressure to breathe. Oxygen sits at the center of this transition. In oxygen-poor water, the ability to breathe air becomes valuable. But building and maintaining air-breathing structures also requires energy. It requires changes in tissue, blood flow, muscular control, and behavior. Mitochondria would have been central to this process. If oxygen availability changes, mitochondrial function changes. If mitochondrial function changes, the energy economy of development changes. Tissues involved in oxygen capture, transport, and use may receive different developmental priority. In a stable open water environment, energy investment in swimming may dominate. In shallow, oxygen-stressed environments, the developmental value of supplementary breathing, stronger paired fins, and substrate-based movement increases. The FM framework proposes that repeated exposure to these conditions could bias development toward structures useful in that mixed environment. Not because the fish wanted to walk. Not because the environment designed a limb. But because oxygen stress, substrate contact, and air exposure repeatedly altered the developmental economy of the organism. Over many generations, energy was redirected. From fin to limb. A limb is not simply a fin with extra strength. A limb is an integrated system. It requires bones capable of bearing weight. It requires joints that bend in controlled ways. It requires muscles arranged for pushing and lifting. It requires nerves capable of coordinating movement. It requires blood vessels supplying active tissue. It requires posture, balance, and sensory feedback. This is why the fish-to-land transition is such a powerful case study. A purely isolated trait explanation is not enough. The transition required many systems to shift together. The FM framework offers one way to understand that coordination. Development does not build the body as a collection of independent parts. It builds systems. When the developmental environment changes consistently, energy allocation may shift across those systems together. A fin used mainly for steering can become more involved in support. A shoulder region connected rigidly to the skull can loosen. A head can begin to move independently, and a primitive lung can become more important. A body shaped for swimming can begin to manage pushing, propping, and eventually walking. Each change matters on its own. But the transformation only works because they occur together. One of the most important changes was the emergence of a neck, the ability to move the head independently from the shoulder region. This was not a decorative change. It altered breathing, feeding, sensing, and movement in shallow water and early terrestrial environments. After the crossing, once the first tetrapod body plan stabilized, evolution did not stop. It opened. The land offered new environments: riverbanks, forests, floodplains, soils, air, vegetation, insects, and eventually entirely terrestrial ecosystems. Each of these created new priming environments. Early tetrapods diversified. Some remained tied closely to water. Others moved farther onto land. Eventually, one of the greatest developmental innovations appeared: the amniotic egg. The amniotic egg allowed vertebrates to reproduce away from water. It carried a private aquatic environment inside a protective structure. In FM terms, this is a beautiful example of evolutionary transformation through developmental reorganization. The organism did not merely adapt to land as an adult. It changed the developmental environment of its offspring. The egg itself became part of the solution. Open question. The fossil sequence from lobe-finned fish to early tetrapods is strong. The broad environmental pressures are also clear. The open question is developmental. How exactly did shallow water priming alter gene expression, mitochondrial function, energy allocation, and skeletal development across generations? Which molecular pathways were involved? How did repeated environmental signals bias paired fins toward weight-bearing structures? The FM framework does not claim to have all those answers yet. It offers a way to ask the question: what if the move from water to land was not only a story of selection acting on random variation, but also a story of environmental signals repeatedly entering development, reallocating energy, and stabilizing a new body plan? If that is correct, then the first steps onto land began long before any animal walked. They began in the embryo, in the egg, in the shallow water, in the mitochondria, and in the repeated signals of a world changing at the edge of land. Chapter 8. The Origin of Flight. 3 Leaps, 1 Solution. Quote: flight evolved independently 3 times in vertebrates. The FM framework asks not why it happened, but why the same solution kept appearing under similar pressure. Rob Coe, 2026. Flight is one of evolution's most remarkable achievements. It is also one of its most revealing. The ability to move through the air did not evolve once. It evolved multiple times, in separate lineages, using different anatomical solutions. Insects were the first to achieve powered flight. Pterosaurs later became the first flying vertebrates. Birds evolved flight from feathered theropod dinosaurs. Bats evolved flight from small mammals. Each lineage used different materials. Insects used wings from the thorax. Pterosaurs used a membrane supported by an elongated 4th finger. Birds used feathered forelimbs. Bats used elongated fingers joined by skin. The structures are different. The problem is the same. How does an animal gain access to the air? This makes flight a powerful test case for the feedback mechanism. If similar environmental pressures produce similar functional outcomes in different lineages, then evolution is not simply wandering at random. It is responding to recurring conditions through the developmental possibilities available to each lineage. The pressure of elevation. The common theme behind flight is elevation. Before powered flight, there are many partial advantages: climbing, falling safely, gliding, leaping, escaping predators, reaching food, moving between branches, regulating temperature, displaying to mates, and catching prey. A forest is not flat. A swamp is not flat. A canopy is not flat. A cliff, branch, trunk, fern, or elevated surface creates a three-dimensional world. In such environments, the ability to move through air, even poorly at first, can matter. The FM framework interprets this as a repeated developmental signal. Invest in structures that help the organism use vertical space. Not every lineage can respond in the same way. A mammal does not have the same developmental toolkit as an insect. A dinosaur does not have the same body plan as a pterosaur. Each lineage begins from its own history. But if the pressure is similar, each lineage may redirect its own available structures toward the same broad function. This is convergence. Established evidence. Flight evolved independently in several major groups. Insects achieved flight first, during the Paleozoic. Pterosaurs appeared later as flying reptiles. Birds evolved from feathered theropod dinosaurs. Bats evolved within mammals. The fossil and developmental evidence shows that these wings are not the same structure repeated identically. They are different anatomical solutions. That is precisely what makes them important. Convergent evolution shows that similar ecological pressures can produce similar outcomes, even when the structures used to reach those outcomes differ. FM interpretation. Same signal, different toolkits. The FM interpretation is simple. The environment does not specify the exact structure, it supplies the pressure. The lineage supplies the toolkit. If the pressure is access to elevation, the developmental response depends on what the organism already has. An insect has thoracic outgrowths and a lightweight exoskeleton. A pterosaur has forelimbs and fingers that can support a membrane. A theropod dinosaur has feathers, forelimbs, balance, and bipedal movement. A small mammal has grasping hands, skin membranes, nocturnal sensory systems, and flexible shoulders. The same environmental problem, movement through air, is solved through different inherited possibilities. This is why FM does not predict identical forms. It predicts functional convergence through lineage-specific development. The signal repeats. The response differs. The result converges. Insects, the first flight. Insects were the first animals to achieve powered flight. Their origin of flight remains debated, but the broad ecological context is clear. Early terrestrial ecosystems contained plants, vertical surfaces, and complex habitats. For small arthropods, even modest aerial ability could offer advantages: escaping predators, reaching food, dispersing to new habitats, finding mates, or controlling descent. The insect wing may have developed from lateral extensions of the body, possibly first useful for gliding, thermoregulation, display, or maneuvering. From an FM perspective, the key point is not that one exact pathway must be correct. The key point is that repeated use of vertical space would have changed the developmental value of surface extensions. A small flap that once helped with heat regulation or stability could become more useful for movement. Once movement through air became useful, selection would refine it. Development would continue to allocate energy toward it. Over generations, the structure could become larger, stronger, more controlled, and more integrated with muscles and nerves. The wing begins as possibility. The environment makes it valuable. Selection refines it. Pterosaurs, the membrane wing. Pterosaurs were the first vertebrates to achieve powered flight. Their solution was unlike the bird wing or bat wing. The pterosaur wing was a membrane supported largely by an elongated fourth finger. This is a remarkable example of developmental redirection. The finger did not become slightly longer for no reason. In the FM framework, its elongation is interpreted as part of a broader reallocation of developmental energy toward aerial movement, surface control, and maneuverability. The Triassic world after the end Permian extinction was ecologically open. Many niches had been emptied. New forms of movement, feeding, and escape became possible. Small archosaurs living in complex habitats may have experienced repeated pressures favoring climbing, leaping, gliding, and control of body surfaces. Over many generations, the developmental program of the forelimb could be biased toward extension, membrane support, and aerial function. Birds. The feathered wing. Bird flight is the best documented of the vertebrate flight transitions. Birds evolved from theropod dinosaurs, and many non-avian theropods already had feathers before powered flight existed. This is important because it shows that feathers did not begin as flight structures. They likely served other functions first: insulation, display, camouflage, brooding, or sensory roles. This fits the FM framework well. A structure can begin with one function and later be redirected toward another. The developmental program already exists. The energy investment is already being made. The structure is already part of the body. When the environment changes, or when a lineage enters a new ecological context, that existing structure can become available for a new role. Small, feathered dinosaurs living in complex environments may have gained advantages from leaping, climbing, controlled falling, gliding, and using forelimbs for balance. Once feathers began to assist movement through air, selection could refine their shape, arrangement, and control. The wing was not invented from nothing. It was assembled from existing dinosauria materials: feathers, forelimbs, balance, bipedal posture, respiratory efficiency, and behavior. The FM interpretation is that environmental priming and energy allocation may have helped redirect these existing systems toward flight. Bats. The hand wing. Bats are the most recent vertebrates to evolve powered flight. Their solution is different again. A bat wing is not a feathered arm and not a pterosaur finger strut. It is a hand transformed into an aerial surface. The fingers are elongated, and skin stretches between them to form the wing. This is an elegant example of lineage-specific possibility. Mammals already had flexible limbs, digits, skin, shoulders, sensory systems, and high metabolic capacity. Small nocturnal mammals in forested environments faced pressures that could favor climbing, leaping, gliding, catching insects, and moving through three-dimensional space. The same broad signal appears again: elevation, air, prey, escape, movement through complex habitat. But the mammalian toolkit produced a mammalian solution. Not feathers. Not thoracic wings. Not a pterosaur membrane strut. A hand wing. The FM framework interprets this as the same environmental problem being translated through a different developmental history. Flight as coordinated transformation. Flight is never just a wing. This is the central point. A wing without muscle is useless. Muscle without oxygen supply is useless. Oxygen supply without respiratory efficiency is limited. Aerial movement without balance and sensory control is dangerous. A body that cannot manage energy demand cannot sustain flight. Powered flight requires a whole body reorganization. In birds, this includes feathers, wings, powerful muscles, skeletal changes, respiratory adaptations, vision, balance, and behavior. In bats, it includes elongated fingers, membrane skin, shoulder mobility, echolocation in many lineages, high metabolism, and precise neuromuscular control. In insects, it includes wing joints, flight muscles, sensory feedback, and lightweight body design. It is not a single trait. It is a tipping point. It changes how an organism relates to the world. The common logic. Across insects, pterosaurs, birds, and bats, the same broad pattern appears. An environment rewards access to vertical or aerial space. The lineage already contains structures that can be redirected. Development begins investing more energy in those structures. Selection refines the results. Different bodies. Different wings. One evolutionary theme. Open question. The origin of flight remains an active area of research. In insects, the exact origin of wings is still debated. In pterosaurs, the early transitional fossils are limited. In birds, the feather-to-flight pathway is much better documented, but the exact developmental pressures that turn feathers from insulation or display into aerodynamic structures remain complex. In bats, the early fossil record leaves important gaps. The FM framework does not claim to solve every detail. It offers a way to connect the pattern. Flight repeatedly emerges when environmental conditions reward elevation, when lineage-specific structures are available for redirection, and when energy allocation can support the whole body demands of aerial life. The question is not simply, how did wings evolve? The deeper question is, why did different lineages, facing similar environmental opportunities, repeatedly redirect their bodies toward the air. That is the evolutionary tipping point hidden inside the origin of flight. Chapter 9. After the asteroid, the rise of mammals. Quote, "The extinction did not create mammals. It released them." Rob Coe, 2026. 66 million years ago, an asteroid struck the Earth. The impact occurred near what is now the Yucatan Peninsula. The consequences were global. Dust and aerosols entered the atmosphere. Sunlight was reduced. Food webs collapsed. Plants suffered. Many large animals disappeared. The non-avian dinosaurs, which had dominated the land for more than 160 million years, were gone. But the asteroid did not create mammals. Mammals already existed. They had lived alongside the dinosaurs for most of the Mesozoic. They were not new. They were not waiting to be invented. They were already there, small, warm-blooded, mostly nocturnal, often insect-eating, and developmentally rich with unrealized possibility. The asteroid did something else. It removed the constraint. This chapter is about ecological release, the moment when a lineage that has been held within narrow boundaries suddenly finds those boundaries removed. From the perspective of the feedback mechanism, the rise of mammals after the asteroid was not simply a matter of empty niches being filled by random variation. It may also have been a moment when a suppressed developmental potential was released into a new priming environment. Mammals in the shadow of dinosaurs. Mammals first appeared roughly 225 million years ago, around the same broad period as the earliest dinosaurs. For most of the Mesozoic, they remained small. Many were roughly mouse-sized or rat-sized. Most were nocturnal. Many were insectivores or omnivores. They lived under, around, and between the dominant reptilian giants of the age. This does not mean they were primitive failures. They were highly successful within their niche. They had hair. They had high metabolism. They had complex teeth. They had advanced hearing. They had forms of parental care. In some lineages, they had live birth and lactation. They carried many of the features that would later become central to mammalian success. But their ecological range was constrained. Large herbivore roles were occupied by dinosaurs. Large predator roles were occupied by dinosaurs. Daytime dominance belonged largely to dinosaurs. Many open ecological spaces were already filled. The mammals survived, but they did not dominate. For more than 160 million years, their developmental and evolutionary possibilities were held within a narrow corridor. Established evidence. The fossil record shows that mammals existed throughout the Mesozoic, but for most of that time they were generally small-bodied compared with the dominant dinosaurs. After the end Cretaceous extinction, mammalian diversity expanded rapidly. Within a relatively short span of geological time, mammals increased in body size, diversified in diet, occupied new habitats, and eventually gave rise to the major lineages we recognize today: rodents, carnivores, ungulates, bats, primates, whales, elephants, and many others. The broad pattern is well established. Mammals existed before the asteroid, mammals survived the extinction, and mammals radiated dramatically after the dinosaurs disappeared. The question is not whether this happened. The question is how to interpret it. The FM interpretation: suppressed potential. From the FM perspective, the most interesting point is not that mammals diversified after the asteroid. It is that they had been developmentally constrained for so long before it. For 160 million years, mammalian life was shaped by the presence of dinosaurs. The priming environment for mammals was not neutral. It repeatedly rewarded small size, nocturnal behavior, sensory caution, metabolic efficiency, rapid reproduction, burrowing, hiding, and flexible feeding. Those were not weaknesses. They were survival strategies. But survival strategies also shape development. If generation after generation of mammals lived under dinosaur dominance, then mammalian development was repeatedly primed toward the traits that worked in that world. Smallness, night vision, smell, hearing, metabolic control, parental care, behavioral flexibility. The FM framework proposes that these repeated signals did not merely preserve mammals. They prepared them. They created a lineage with high developmental responsiveness, high metabolic intensity, and a rich set of latent possibilities. When the dinosaurs disappeared, the priming environment changed almost completely. The pressure to remain small weakened. Daytime niches opened, large herbivore roles opened, large predator roles opened, new diets became available, new habitats became less dangerous, and new social and behavioral strategies became viable. The old constraint was removed. The signal changed. The asteroid as a developmental reset. Mass extinctions are usually described in terms of death. That is understandable. The end Cretaceous extinction was catastrophic. Many lineages vanished. The world after the impact was harsh, unstable, and biologically impoverished. A small mammal born before the asteroid entered a world dominated by dinosaurs. A small mammal born after the extinction entered a world in which many of those dominant forms were gone. That is not only ecological release. It is developmental release. Mitochondria, energy, and mammalian expansion. Mammals are energetically demanding animals. They are warm-blooded. They maintain internal body temperature. They invest heavily in brains, sensory systems, reproduction, and parental care. These traits are costly, but they are also powerful. As mammals expanded into new niches, different energy strategies became valuable. A grazing mammal required digestive investment. A predator required muscle, speed, senses, and coordination. A burrower required compact strength and digging ability. A primate required vision, grasping, social learning, and brain investment. A bat required flight metabolism. And a whale required aquatic thermoregulation, diving physiology, and enormous body reorganization. Each new ecological role demanded a different energy budget. The brain and behavioral flexibility. One of the most important mammalian advantages was behavioral flexibility. After the asteroid, the world was not simply empty. It was unstable. Food sources changed. Habitats changed. Competition changed. Survival required exploration, memory, learning, and adaptability. Brains are expensive. They consume enormous energy relative to their size. In a stable environment where simple behavior is enough, a larger brain may not justify its cost. But in a changing environment, flexibility can become valuable. This is another example of energy allocation. When the environment rewards flexibility, energy invested in neural development may provide a high return. Mammalian brains did not become large in every lineage at once, but across the post-Cretaceous world, cognitive and sensory expansion became increasingly important in many groups. The FM framework interprets this as part of the mammalian cascade. The post-impact world rewarded animals that could learn, explore, adapt, and exploit new niches. Mammals were already prepositioned for this. The extinction event amplified the opportunity. Why mammals? Why did mammals radiate so dramatically, rather than some other surviving group? The standard answer is that mammals had the right traits at the right time. They were small enough to survive. They could hide. They could eat varied diets. Their metabolism allowed activity in cooler conditions. Their teeth allowed efficient processing of food. Their parental care supported offspring survival. All of that is true. FM adds another layer. Mammals were not only ecologically suited to survival. They were developmentally suited to rapid diversification. Their embryos developed in intimate physiological connection with the parent, especially in placental mammals. Their young were shaped by lactation, care, warmth, social contact, and learning. Their high metabolism made them responsive to energy availability. Their mitochondria-rich physiology allowed rapid shifts in energy use. In other words, mammals had a rich developmental feedback system already in place. Once the dinosaur constraint was removed, that system could explore new directions. Open question. The rise of mammals after the asteroid is well established. The FM interpretation is a proposed way of reading that event. The open question is whether mammalian diversification is best explained by ecological opportunity alone, or whether developmental priming and energy allocation also played a significant role in directing the variation that selection acted upon. This could, in principle, be studied through comparative developmental biology, fossil growth patterns, metabolic modeling, and the genetics of post-Cretaceous mammalian lineages. The asteroid did not create mammals. It changed the world around them. And in that changed world, the developmental possibilities mammals had carried for millions of years were finally released. Chapter 10. Transitional Fossils and the Speed of Change. Quote, "The fossil record looks the way it does because evolution works the way FM says it does. The gaps are not a flaw in the evidence. They may be a signature of the mechanism." Rob Coe, 2026. Since Darwin published On the Origin of Species, one objection has appeared again and again. where are all the transitional fossils? If one kind of organism gradually becomes another, should the rocks not be full of intermediate forms? Should we not find endless chains linking every major group to every other group? The question is understandable. If evolution were always slow, smooth, continuous, and evenly spread across enormous populations, then we might expect the fossil record to show a more complete sequence of gradual change. But the fossil record does not usually look like that. It often shows long periods in which species appear relatively stable, followed by the appearance of new forms. Transitional fossils exist, and some are extraordinary, but they are rare. They are precious precisely because they are uncommon. This chapter argues that the rarity of transitional fossils is not necessarily a weakness for the feedback mechanism. It may be one of the patterns the framework predicts. The fossil record is not life itself. The first point is simple but important. The fossil record is not a complete record of life. It is a tiny, damaged, selective archive. Most organisms never fossilize. Most soft-bodied animals disappear without trace. Most dead bodies are eaten, decay, scatter, or dissolve. Even when remains are buried, they must survive pressure, chemistry, erosion, tectonic movement, and millions of years of geological change. Then the fossil must be exposed. Then someone must find it. Then it must be recognized for what it is. This is an astonishing sequence of accidents. The surprise is not that the fossil record has gaps. The surprise is that we have as much as we do. Established evidence. Fossilization is rare. For a fossil to form, conditions must be unusually favorable. Rapid burial helps. Hard parts help. Stable sediment helps. Low oxygen can help preserve remains. Mineralization must occur. Geological processes must not destroy the fossil before it is discovered. This means the fossil record is strongly biased. Hard-bodied organisms are more likely to be preserved than soft-bodied ones. Marine environments often preserve better than many terrestrial environments. Large populations living in sediment-rich environments are more likely to leave fossils than small isolated populations in upland forests, river margins, or fragile habitats. Many species that once existed will never be known. This alone explains much of the incompleteness of the fossil record. But FM adds a second reason transitional fossils may be rare. Transitions may be geologically fast. The feedback mechanism does not propose that major transitions happen instantly. They do not. They unfold over many generations. They may take hundreds of thousands or millions of years. But compared with long periods of evolutionary stability, that can be fast. This matters for fossil preservation. If a lineage remains stable for 10 million years, it has a long window in which fossils may form. If a transitional phase lasts only a few 100,000 years, the window is much smaller. If the transition occurs in a small, isolated population, the chance of fossilization becomes smaller again. The transitional form may have existed. It may even have been common locally. But if it existed for a short time, in a restricted place, in conditions poor for fossil preservation, we may never find it. This is why the fossil record can make evolutionary change look more sudden than it was. The change was not instant. The archive is incomplete. FM interpretation. The FM framework predicts that major transitions should often be concentrated. If a strong environmental signal affects a small or isolated population across many generations, the FM cascade may move that population directionally. Developmental priming, mitochondrial response, energy allocation, epigenetic stabilization, and selection may all reinforce the change. In this model, transitional forms are not expected to be evenly spread across the whole world for tens of millions of years. They are more likely to appear in particular environments, at particular times, under particular pressures. This means the fossil record should show a pattern. Long periods of relative stability, rare transitional windows, and then the appearance of a new stabilized form. This resembles the pattern described by punctuated equilibrium. FM proposes a possible developmental reason for it. Transitional fossils do exist. It is important not to overstate the argument. Transitional fossils are not absent. They exist, and some are among the most important fossils ever found. Tiktaalik helps illuminate the transition from fish to land vertebrates. Archaeopteryx sits near the boundary between non-avian dinosaurs and birds. Pachycetus and other early whale relatives help show how land mammals return to the water. Feathered dinosaurs reveal stages in the evolution of bird-like features. Early horse fossils show changes in limbs and teeth. Hominin fossils show branching transitions in human evolution. These fossils matter because they show that major transitions were real. They also show that transitions were not cartoons. A transitional fossil is not a perfect halfway creature. It is an organism adapted to its own environment, carrying a mixture of ancestral and derived traits. Tiktaalik was not trying to become an amphibian, Archaeopteryx was not trying to become a modern bird, and Pachycetus was not trying to become a whale. Each was a living organism in its own world, shaped by its own pressures. Why the gaps matter? The gaps in the fossil record should not be dismissed, but they should not be misunderstood. A gap does not mean nothing happened. It means the archive is incomplete. The FM framework interprets some gaps as the expected result of concentrated transitions. If major evolutionary change occurs in smaller populations, over shorter geological windows, and under specific environmental stress, then transitional fossils should be difficult to find. This does not prove FM. A theory does not become true simply because evidence is missing. But it does mean the fossil pattern is compatible with FM. More importantly, it gives us predictions. If FM is correct, transitional fossils should be found disproportionately in periods following environmental disruption, small or geographically restricted populations, settings where developmental pressures were intense, and lineages showing coordinated multisystem change rather than isolated trait shifts. That is a testable idea. Speed and direction. The deeper issue is not just fossil rarity. It is the relationship between speed and direction. A purely random search through all possible mutations is slow because it has no target. It produces variation without knowing what the environment requires. Natural selection then filters the result. FM proposes that some variation may be developmentally biased by the environment before selection acts. If oxygen is low, respiratory and circulatory systems may become developmentally important. If darkness persists, visual systems may be reduced. If substrate contact becomes central to survival, limbs or supporting structures may receive more developmental investment. This does not guarantee success, but it gives change a direction. Direction makes change more efficient. An efficient change leaves a different fossil pattern from slow, evenly distributed change. The fossil record as a shadow. The fossil record is not the process itself. It is the shadow left behind by the process. If the process is slow and continuous, the shadow should be long and gradual. If the process is stable for long periods and concentrated during environmental thresholds, the shadow will look different: long stillness, then change, persistence, then appearance, stability, then transformation. This is the pattern that has always made evolution so fascinating. Darwin saw the problem. Gould and Eldridge described the rhythm. FM asks what developmental mechanism might help produce it, turning an objection into a question. The scarcity of transitional fossils has often been used as an objection to evolution. But a better approach is to turn the objection into a question. What kind of evolutionary process would produce a fossil record like this? A process that changes every lineage slowly and evenly would produce one kind of record. A process that remains stable for long periods, then shifts rapidly in small populations under environmental pressure, would produce another. FM belongs to the second kind. It suggests that the fossil record is not merely incomplete. It may also be patterned. Its gaps may not be random gaps. Some may mark the very places where development, environment, energy, and selection interacted most intensely. Open question. The open question is how to distinguish between absence of evidence and evidence of a rapid transition. This requires careful paleontology, dating, developmental biology, and ecological reconstruction. It also requires humility. Some gaps are simply gaps. Some may close with new discoveries. Others may remain permanently invisible. Where should we look for transitional fossils? What environments are most likely to preserve them? What kinds of multisystem change should they show? And what environmental disruptions should surround them? The rocks may not preserve every step. But sometimes, if we are lucky, they preserve enough to see the direction. Chapter 11. Slow signals, sudden leaps, new species. Quote, "A species does not leap into being in a single generation, but the threshold it crosses may be crossed in one." Rob Coe, 2026. Evolutionary transformation is slow by human standards. It takes generations. Often it takes thousands, tens of thousands, or hundreds of thousands of generations. But not all slow processes are the same. A random walk and a directed path can both take time. The difference is that one wanders, while the other accumulates in a meaningful direction. This is the heart of the FM argument. Environmental priming does not make evolution instant. It may make it more directional. It may cause development to respond again and again to the same environmental pressures, so that change accumulates along a path rather than spreading evenly in all directions. A species does not appear suddenly, but the conditions that make a new species possible can build slowly, until a threshold is crossed. This chapter traces that process. The environment speaks. Every FM cascade begins with an environmental signal. This signal is not abstract. It is physical. It is chemical. It is energetic. It may be the amount of oxygen dissolved in shallow water. It may be the temperature surrounding an egg. It may be the stress hormone circulating in a pregnant mother. It may be the nutrients available to a developing embryo. It may be the light reaching a forest floor, the acidity of an ocean, the texture of a substrate, or the seasonal rhythm of food. These signals reach the developing organism before it enters the world as an independent individual. That point matters. The organism is not being shaped only after birth by survival. It is being prepared during development by the conditions surrounding its formation. The world leaves an imprint before life begins its first independent act. The signal is repeated. One environmental signal in one generation rarely changes the evolutionary direction of a lineage. The power of FM lies in repetition. If the same signal appears generation after generation, it becomes more than a temporary pressure. It becomes part of the developmental environment of the lineage. A low oxygen pool affects one generation. A low oxygen ecosystem lasting thousands of generations becomes something else. It becomes a repeated developmental message. The same is true of darkness, cold, heat, new food, new predators, new surfaces, new social structures, or new ecological opportunity. Each generation receives the signal, each generation responds, each generation is tested by selection, and each surviving generation passes on a slightly altered starting point. This is how a flexible response can begin to harden into a lineage tendency. Once each generation begins passing on a slightly altered developmental starting point, through the mitochondrial response and energy reallocation described in Chapter 3, the cumulative direction of change becomes visible. When two populations stop receiving the same signals, the stage is set for divergence. A population begins to diverge. Speciation begins when populations stop sharing the same developmental path. This may happen because a population becomes geographically isolated, or because part of a population begins living in a different environment, or because an ecological shift exposes one group to a different priming signal. Once that happens, the feedback loop changes. One population receives one set of signals. Another population receives another. Over time, their developmental priorities diverge. Their bodies may change. Their behaviors may change. Their timing of reproduction may change. Their mating signals may change. Their embryonic development may become less compatible. At first, the difference may be small. Later, it becomes stable. Eventually, the two populations may no longer interbreed successfully. At that point, what began as environmental priming has crossed into speciation. The threshold. The threshold is not a single visible line. There is no moment when nature announces, a new species has begun. But biologically, a threshold is crossed when the developmental and reproductive differences between two populations become stable enough that they now follow separate evolutionary futures. The signals are slow. The leap appears sudden only when viewed from a distance. A species forms gradually, but in the fossil record, we may see the before and after more clearly than the transition. Quantum biology. At the deepest level, environmental signals ultimately affect molecules. Proteins fold, enzymes react, receptors bind, and energy moves through biological systems. Some of these processes may involve quantum effects, as modern biology increasingly recognizes. Open question. The open question is how far environmental priming can travel. We know that environmental conditions can affect development. We know that mitochondria respond to those conditions. We know that epigenetic marks can influence gene expression. We know that selection can stabilize traits. What remains to be shown is how often these processes combine into a long-term evolutionary pathway capable of producing speciation or major transformation. That is the testable challenge for FM. If the theory is correct, then new species should not arise only from random genetic drift and selection. In some cases, they should arise from repeated environmental signals that bias development in consistent directions across generations. A new species, in this framework, is not created by one signal, one mutation, or one moment. It is formed by a conversation repeated until it becomes inheritance. Chapter 12. The Great Extinctions and the Animals They Built. Quote, "Every animal alive today is the descendant of a survivor. And every survivor was shaped by the world that nearly destroyed it." Rob Coe, 2026. Mass extinctions are usually remembered for what they destroy. That is understandable. An extinction event is a rupture in the history of life. Species vanish. Ecosystems collapse. Food webs break. The world that existed before does not fully return. But extinction is not only an ending. For the survivors, it is also the beginning of a new developmental world. This chapter looks at mass extinctions not only as events of death, but as events of evolutionary reorganization. The central question is not simply which animals disappeared. It is what kind of world remained for those that survived. That world matters because the survivors did not develop in the same conditions as their ancestors. Their offspring entered environments with different temperatures, oxygen levels, food sources, predators, competitors, light conditions, and ecological opportunities. From the perspective of the feedback mechanism, extinction events do not merely clear ecological space. They change the priming environment. And when the priming environment changes deeply enough, evolutionary tipping points may follow. Extinction as environmental reset. A mass extinction is not one event in biological terms. It is a cascade of environmental changes. An asteroid impact does not only kill organisms at the point of impact. It changes light, temperature, plant growth, food webs, atmospheric chemistry, and ecological relationships. A volcanic mega-event does not only produce lava. It alters carbon dioxide, sulfur, acid rain, ocean chemistry, climate, and oxygen availability. A severe glaciation does not only make the world colder. It changes sea level, habitat area, ocean circulation, nutrient flow, light, and the distribution of life. For the organisms that survive, these changes become developmental signals. The next generation develops in a different world. That is the key FM insight. Extinction is not only selection through death. It is also priming through survival. 3 types of extinction trigger. Impacts, a sudden shock with long consequences. The most famous example is the Chicxulub impact at the end of the Cretaceous. A large asteroid struck Earth roughly 66 million years ago. The immediate effects were catastrophic, but the longer consequences mattered just as much: reduced sunlight, cooling, disrupted photosynthesis, collapsing food webs, and a radically altered ecological landscape. For non-avian dinosaurs, the impact was the end. For mammals, birds, and other survivors, it was the beginning of a different world. In FM terms, the impact did not merely remove competitors. It changed the signals reaching the survivors' offspring. The world after the asteroid favored different body sizes, different diets, different behaviors, different reproductive strategies, and different energy budgets. That is why the rise of mammals belongs in the story of extinction. It was not simply that mammals survived. It was that their developmental future opened. Volcanic mega-events, slow catastrophe. Some extinction events were linked not to sudden impact, but to prolonged volcanic activity. Large igneous provinces can pour vast amounts of lava and gas into the atmosphere over long periods. They can alter climate, acidify oceans, reduce oxygen, disrupt rainfall, and change the chemistry of life. From an FM perspective, these events are especially important because they last long enough to create repeated developmental signals across many generations. An asteroid impact may be sudden, but a volcanic mega-event can become a long environmental instruction. Heat, acidification, low oxygen, altered food webs, and changing habitats do not simply select organisms once. They shape the conditions under which generation after generation develops. This is exactly the kind of sustained pressure that could help drive an FM cascade. Gamma-ray bursts, a speculative trigger. The possibility that a gamma-ray burst contributed to the end Ordovician extinction has been proposed, but it remains contested. It should therefore be handled as an open question, not as established fact. A nearby gamma-ray burst could, in theory, damage the ozone layer, increase ultraviolet radiation, affect climate, and disrupt shallow marine ecosystems. But this remains one possible explanation among others, including glaciation and ocean anoxia. In the book, this section is worth keeping, but it should be cautious. It is useful because it shows that extinction triggers can be invisible, atmospheric, or cosmic, not only geological. But it should not be presented as settled. The safe framing is, some extinction triggers are established. Others remain hypotheses. FM does not depend on any single proposed trigger being correct. What matters is the biological effect, the creation of a changed developmental environment for survivors. Established evidence. The association between extinction events and later evolutionary radiations is well established. The end Permian extinction was followed by major restructuring of terrestrial and marine ecosystems. The end Triassic extinction helped open space for dinosaur dominance. The end Cretaceous extinction was followed by the mammalian radiation. Other events reshaped marine life, plant life, arthropods, vertebrates, and ecological networks. This does not mean extinctions cause new forms in a simple way. It means extinction events often change the conditions under which evolution proceeds. They remove some constraints. They create new opportunities. They alter selection pressures. They reorganize the developmental environment. That combination is exactly what FM expects at major tipping points. The map from crisis to new form. Looking across the history of life, a pattern emerges from the major extinction events and the radiations that followed them. Around 541 million years ago, the Cambrian explosion followed oxygen spikes and ocean mineralization, producing the first fish and all major animal body plans. Around 444 million years ago, the end Ordovician extinction, driven by glaciation and ocean anoxia, allowed jawed fish to diversify and vascular plants to colonize land. Around 375 million years ago, the late Devonian extinction produced the first amphibians and the movement from water to land. Around 252 million years ago, the end Permian, the Great Dying, saw 96% of marine species and 70% of land species lost. Archosaurs and the ancestors of true mammals emerged in its wake. Around 201 million years ago, the end Triassic extinction allowed dinosaurs to dominate and pterosaurs to achieve the first vertebrate flight. Around 66 million years ago, the end Cretaceous asteroid and volcanic events removed the non-avian dinosaurs, while mammals radiated into every available ecological niche. Each event altered the priming environment in which surviving lineages developed and diversified. FM interpretation. The FM interpretation of mass extinctions is that they combine three forces. First, they remove. Species disappear. Competitors vanish. Predators decline. Food webs collapse. Ecological space opens. Second, they signal. The physical and chemical environment changes. Oxygen, temperature, light, food, stress, and energy availability shift. These changes reach developing organisms. Third, they redirect. Surviving lineages begin developing in a world where different traits matter. Energy allocation changes. Latent developmental pathways may become more valuable. Selection begins testing new possibilities. This is why extinction can be followed by creativity. Mass extinctions and evolutionary first appearances. Fish, amphibians, reptiles, dinosaurs, mammals, and birds. The broad history of vertebrates can be read through this pattern. Early fish emerged in a world where oxygen, minerals, movement, and predation were becoming increasingly important. Amphibians arose from lineages facing shallow water instability and oxygen stress. Reptiles expanded through terrestrial environments where the amniotic egg became a solution to reproduction away from water. Dinosaurs rose after ecological disruption opened space for their efficient bodies and upright posture. Birds emerged from dinosaurian lineages that had already crossed the flight threshold. Mammals radiated after the end Cretaceous extinction removed the dinosaur constraint. This does not mean every major group was produced by one extinction event. Evolution is more complex than that. But it does suggest a recurring pattern. Environmental disruption changes the developmental and ecological rules, and surviving lineages explore new possibilities within those rules. The survivor principle. Every animal alive today is descended from survivors. That sounds obvious, but it is profound. Our ancestors passed through filters we rarely think about: ice ages, anoxic oceans, volcanic winters, impacts, droughts, floods, competition, starvation, disease, and changing atmospheres. Survival was not passive. The survivors did not simply endure unchanged. They were shaped by the worlds that nearly ended them. This is one of the deepest ideas in the feedback mechanism. A mass extinction is not only a cut in the tree of life. It is also a change in the soil, the light, the air, and the conditions under which the remaining branches grow. Open question. The open question is how directly extinction-driven environmental change influences development. We know extinction events alter ecosystems. We know they change selection pressures. We know surviving lineages often radiate afterward. The FM question is more specific. Do extinction events also create repeated developmental priming signals that bias energy allocation and developmental pathways in surviving lineages? If so, then mass extinctions are not only ecological resets. They are developmental resets. This would help explain why the history of life is not a smooth expansion, but a rhythm of stability, crisis, survival, and renewal. The animals that emerge after extinction are not built by catastrophe alone. They are built by survivors developing in a new world. Chapter 13. Dinosaur Puzzle. No Aquatic Forms and Extinction. Quote, "The most interesting questions in science are not those we cannot answer, but those we have not yet thought to ask." Rob Coe, 2026. This chapter is different from the others. The previous chapters have dealt with transitions that are already central to evolutionary biology: the Cambrian explosion, the movement from water to land, the origin of flight, the rise of mammals, transitional fossils, and the role of extinction in evolutionary renewal. This chapter is, even, more speculative. It begins with two facts about non-avian dinosaurs that are usually discussed separately, and asks whether the feedback mechanism can help connect them. The first fact is this: in more than 160 million years of dominance, no non-avian dinosaur lineage became truly aquatic. The second fact is this: at the end of the Cretaceous, the non-avian dinosaurs disappeared completely. Not reduced. Not marginalized. Not pushed into a small surviving remnant. Gone. These two facts may not be connected. They may simply be separate outcomes of different evolutionary pressures. But they are interesting enough to place side by side. Why did dinosaurs, so successful on land, never produce a whale-like or ichthyosaur-like aquatic lineage? And why, when the asteroid struck, did not a single non-avian dinosaur lineage survive? This chapter does not claim to solve the puzzle. It offers a possible FM interpretation, that the same deep developmental stability that made dinosaurs so successful may also have made them less flexible when their world changed too suddenly. Fact 1. No dinosaur returned fully to the sea. Many land animals have returned to water. Mammals did it many times. Whales, dolphins, seals, sea lions, manatees, and otters all show different degrees of aquatic return. Birds did it too. Penguins are avian dinosaurs, and they became highly adapted to swimming. Reptiles did it spectacularly in the Mesozoic. Ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs, and mosasaurs all occupied marine roles. But non-avian dinosaurs did not. This is striking because they had time. Dinosaurs dominated terrestrial ecosystems for more than 160 million years. They occupied many body sizes and ecological roles. Some were predators. Some were herbivores. Some were small and agile. Some were enormous. Some lived near rivers, floodplains, coasts, and wetlands. Yet none became truly aquatic in the way whales did among mammals or ichthyosaurs did among reptiles. Spinosaurus may have been semi-aquatic or strongly associated with water, but even it does not represent a fully marine dinosaur lineage comparable to whales, dolphins, or ichthyosaurs. The sea was available. Other groups entered it. Dinosaurs did not. Established evidence. The absence of fully aquatic non-avian dinosaurs is broadly consistent with the fossil record. Marine reptiles were abundant during the Mesozoic, but they were not dinosaurs. Ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs, and mosasaurs belong to other reptilian lineages. Crocodilian relatives also developed semi-aquatic and aquatic forms. Birds, the surviving avian dinosaurs, later produced penguins and other water-adapted forms. Non-avian dinosaurs, however, remained overwhelmingly terrestrial. This absence is not proof of anything by itself. Absence in the fossil record must always be handled carefully. But given the duration and diversity of dinosaur evolution, the lack of a clearly aquatic non-avian dinosaur lineage is at least worth asking about. Fact 2. Total non-avian dinosaur extinction. The second fact is even more familiar. At the end of the Cretaceous, roughly 66 million years ago, a mass extinction occurred. Many groups were affected. Large animals suffered heavily. Food webs collapsed. The world changed rapidly. Mammals survived. Birds survived. Crocodilians survived. Turtles survived. Lizards and snakes survived. Amphibians and fish survived. But the non-avian dinosaurs did not. This is one of the great facts of evolutionary history. The group that had dominated terrestrial ecosystems for more than 160 million years vanished completely, except for the avian lineage. Standard explanations focus on body size, food availability, reproductive biology, eggs, metabolism, ecological dependence, and the severity of the post-impact world. These explanations matter. They should not be dismissed. But the FM framework asks a slightly different question. What did long-term success do to dinosaur developmental flexibility? The stability hypothesis. The Mesozoic was not perfectly stable. No period of Earth history is. There were climate changes, sea level shifts, ecological pressures, volcanic events, and local disruptions. But compared with some of the extreme transitions that triggered other evolutionary cascades, the dinosaur-dominated world was remarkably persistent. For a very long time, dinosaurs were the dominant large terrestrial animals. Their body plans worked. Their developmental programs worked. Their ecological strategies worked. In FM terms, that success matters. A lineage that receives similar environmental signals across millions of generations may become deeply primed for the world it inhabits. Its developmental pathways are reinforced. Its body plan becomes canalized. Its successful strategies are repeated generation after generation. That stability is powerful. It produces reliability. It produces dominance. It allows a lineage to become exquisitely matched to its world. But it may also have a cost. A lineage that is very deeply adapted to one kind of world may become less flexible when that world changes beyond recognition. This is the stability hypothesis. The dinosaurs may have been successful not because they were evolutionarily weak, but because they were so well matched to the Mesozoic terrestrial world. Their success may have deepened their developmental commitment to that world. And when the world changed suddenly, that commitment became vulnerability. FM interpretation. From the FM perspective, prolonged environmental stability can reinforce developmental pathways. Each generation develops under broadly similar signals. The same body plan is rewarded. The same energy priorities are maintained. The same ecological strategies succeed. Over time, the developmental system becomes more stable, but also more resistant to radical redirection. This may help explain the two dinosaur puzzles. First, the absence of fully aquatic non-avian dinosaurs. If dinosaurs were deeply primed for terrestrial dominance, then the environmental signals required to push a lineage toward full aquatic life may not have been strong enough, consistent enough, or convergent enough to overcome that established terrestrial developmental program. Second, total extinction. When the end Cretaceous event struck, the world changed rapidly. Darkness, cooling, food web collapse, ecological disruption, and reproductive pressure created a priming environment radically different from the one in which non-avian dinosaurs had flourished. If their developmental programs were deeply stabilized around the old world, they may have lacked the flexibility to respond quickly enough. This does not mean they were inferior. It may mean they were too specialized, too committed, too deeply shaped by the world they had mastered. Why birds survived? Birds complicate the story in an important way. Birds are dinosaurs. More precisely, they are avian dinosaurs. So the dinosaur lineage did not disappear completely. One branch survived. Why? The FM framework offers a possible interpretation. The evolution of flight was itself a major tipping point. It required extensive developmental reorganization: feathers, wings, respiratory changes, balance, metabolism, vision, and behavior. A lineage that had already undergone such a transformation may have retained greater developmental and ecological flexibility than large terrestrial non-avian dinosaurs. Birds were smaller. They could fly. Many could exploit different food sources. Some may have survived on seeds. Their mobility gave them access to fragmented environments. Their body plan had already been reorganized around lightness, energy efficiency, and movement through three-dimensional space. In FM terms, birds may have retained a more flexible developmental relationship with the environment. They were dinosaurs, but dinosaurs that had already crossed a major FM cascade. Why crocodilians survived. Crocodilians also complicate the hypothesis. They were large reptiles with long Mesozoic histories, yet they survived. A possible FM explanation is that crocodilians were never locked into a purely terrestrial priming environment in the same way. Their semi-aquatic ecology exposed them to multiple environmental domains: land, water, mud, riverbanks, seasonal flooding, aquatic prey, terrestrial nesting, and temperature-sensitive incubation. Their developmental and ecological signals were mixed. That may have preserved flexibility. A semi-aquatic lineage does not receive one narrow set of environmental messages. It receives many. Water and land. Heat and shade. Stillness and movement. Aquatic feeding and terrestrial reproduction. This may have allowed crocodilians to survive a disrupted world in which flexibility and low-energy survival were essential. This is only a hypothesis. But it helps explain why the FM question is worth asking. Why small dinosaurs did not survive. The hardest problem for the stability hypothesis is this: why did no small non-avian dinosaur survive? If body size was a major factor, then small dinosaurs should have had a better chance. Some were small. Some were agile. Some may have had varied diets. Yet no non-avian lineage persisted. This suggests that FM cannot be the whole explanation. Egg-laying biology, food availability, incubation needs, growth rates, ecological dependence, and the specific conditions of the post-impact world may all have mattered. The end Cretaceous extinction was not a simple event, and no single explanation is likely to account for everything. The FM stability hypothesis should therefore be treated as one possible layer. It may help explain a pattern, but it does not replace existing explanations. Too successful to change. The deepest question raised by dinosaurs is not why they failed. They did not fail. They dominated land for longer than mammals have so far done. They evolved enormous size, speed, armor, horns, crests, feathers, social behavior, and remarkable ecological diversity. They were one of the most successful groups of animals ever to live. The question is whether success can become a trap. Can a lineage become so well adapted to one world that it loses the flexibility needed for another? Can developmental stability become evolutionary rigidity? Can the repeated reinforcement of a successful form make it harder to cross a new threshold when the environment changes too violently? These are FM questions. They do not overturn standard evolutionary theory. They add another angle to it. The dinosaurs may have disappeared not because they were poorly adapted, but because they were profoundly adapted to a world that ended. Open question. This chapter presents a speculative hypothesis. The connection between dinosaur terrestrial stability, lack of aquatic forms, and total non-avian extinction is not established. It should be treated as a question, not a conclusion. But it is a useful question because it points towards something testable. Does prolonged ecological dominance reduce developmental flexibility in some lineages? Do lineages exposed to multiple environmental domains retain more flexible developmental responses? Are groups that have already undergone major bodoplan transitions more resilient to later environmental disruption? Can we detect signs of developmental canalization or flexibility in fossil growth patterns, reproductive strategies, or comparative evo-devo? The sea was always there. The dinosaurs did not enter it in the way other groups did. Then, when their terrestrial world collapsed, they disappeared, except for the one branch that had already transformed itself for the air. That may be coincidence. Or it may be a clue. Chapter 14. The pattern behind the leaps. Quote, "Evolution does not move evenly. It gathers force, crosses thresholds, and leaves new forms behind." Rob Coe, 2026. By this point in the book, several examples have been explored: the Cambrian explosion, the transition from water to land, the origin of flight, the rise of mammals, transitional fossils, mass extinctions, and the dinosaur puzzle. Each example is different. The Cambrian seas were not the Devonian shallows. The first flying insects were not pterosaurs, birds, or bats. The mammals after the asteroid were not the same kind of transition as fish moving toward land. Dinosaurs raise questions very different from the rise of mammals. But beneath these differences, a pattern begins to appear. Major evolutionary leaps are not random interruptions in the history of life. They tend to occur when environmental change, developmental possibility, energy allocation, and selection align. That is the pattern behind the leaps. The first pattern, environmental change comes first. Every major tipping point begins with a changed world. The Cambrian explosion followed major shifts in oxygen, ocean chemistry, mineral availability, and ecological interaction. The fish-to-land transition occurred in unstable shallow water environments where oxygen stress and substrate contact mattered. Flight emerged in lineages living in three-dimensional habitats where elevation, escape, gliding, display, and aerial movement became valuable. Mammals radiated after the asteroid removed the dinosaur constraint. In each case, the environment was not merely scenery. It changed the signals organisms received during development. Temperature, oxygen, nutrients, light, pressure, stress, competition, and opportunity all influence the conditions under which bodies form. This is the first pattern. Before life changes direction, the world changes the signal. The second pattern, the signal must persist. A single event may begin the process, but it does not complete it. Evolutionary transformation requires repeated signals across generations. The Cambrian did not happen overnight. The movement from water to land did not happen in one animal. Flight did not emerge from one leap. Mammals did not become whales, bats, primates, and elephants in a single post-impact generation. The signal had to persist. This is why the feedback mechanism is not a theory of instant transformation. It is a theory of cumulative direction. Without repetition, the signal fades. With repetition, the signal can become history. The third pattern, development works in systems. Major evolutionary leaps are not single-trait events. A limb requires more than bone. Flight requires more than wings. A mammal's post-asteroid expansion required more than size. A Cambrian predator required more than a mouth. These transitions involve systems: skeleton, muscles, nerves, blood supply, metabolism, behavior, reproduction, and sensory processing. Development builds systems. This is why FM focuses on developmental priming rather than isolated mutation alone. A mutation can affect a trait, but a body plan requires coordination. Developmental programs already coordinate tissues, timing, growth, and energy use. If environmental priming affects those programs, it may bias whole systems at once. This does not remove mutation. It places mutation within a larger developmental context. Genes matter. Regulatory networks matter. Epigenetics matter. Mitochondria matter. Energy matters. Selection matters. The leap happens when these forces align. The fourth pattern, old forms become new forms. Evolution rarely invents from nothing. It modifies what already exists. Tetrapod limbs emerged from fin structures. Bird wings emerged from dinosaurian forelimbs and feathers. Bat wings emerged from mammalian hands. Whale bodies emerged from land mammals. Vertebrate jaws emerged from modified gill arches. Feathers may have begun as insulation or display before becoming part of flight. This is one of the most important patterns in all of evolution. New forms are old forms under new developmental conditions. The feedback mechanism fits this because FM does not claim that the environment creates new structures from nowhere. It proposes that environmental signals may help activate, expand, reduce, redirect, or stabilize developmental possibilities already present in a lineage. The environment changes the conditions. Development reworks the inheritance. Selection preserves what functions. The fifth pattern, stability and change are both active. One of the most important ideas in this book is that stasis is not nothing. When a lineage remains stable for millions of years, it is not because evolution has stopped. It may be because the feedback loop is reinforcing a successful form. The same environment produces the same developmental signals. The same signals reinforce the same traits. Selection preserves the same successful architecture. The lineage remains stable because it is well matched to its world. Then the world changes. The signal changes. If the change is strong enough, sustained enough, and convergent enough, the feedback loop no longer reinforces the old form in quite the same way. It begins to push development toward a new set of priorities. This is the rhythm of tipping points: stability, pressure, threshold, reorganization, new stability. Evolution does not move as a smooth line. It moves in rhythms. The pattern behind the leaps. The pattern behind the leaps is not randomness alone. It is not environment alone. It is not genes alone. It is not development alone. It is the interaction. Life carries inherited possibilities. The environment changes the signal. Mitochondria translate energy conditions. Development reallocates resources. Selection tests the outcome. Generations stabilize what works. This is why major evolutionary transitions can look sudden from a distance, but cumulative up close. The leap is visible. The preparation is hidden. Evolutionary tipping points are the moments when hidden preparation becomes visible form. Chapter 15. Tipping Points and the Future of Evolution. Quote, "The question is not whether tipping points will happen again. The question is, what latent programs are waiting to be released?" Rob Coe, 2026. Evolutionary tipping points are not only events of the past. They may also be part of the future. This raises a difficult question. Are we living through the early conditions of future evolutionary tipping points? A new environmental signal. Human beings have become a geological force. We alter climate, oceans, rivers, forests, soils, cities, coastlines, food webs, light cycles, chemical exposure, and atmospheric conditions. We move species across continents. We remove predators. We create new predators. We fragment habitats. We introduce plastics, pesticides, noise, heat, pollution, artificial light, and new diets. From an evolutionary perspective, this is not one signal. It is many signals at once. For countless organisms, the developmental environment is changing. Eggs develop in warmer sand. Fish embryos develop in warmer and more acidic water. Birds breed under altered seasonal timing. Insects encounter new chemicals. Mammals develop in urban heat, artificial light, altered food sources, and changed predator landscapes. These changes are not abstract. They are physical, chemical, energetic, and developmental. They reach living systems. The FM framework asks whether these signals are strong enough, repeated enough, and convergent enough to alter evolutionary direction over time. Caution about timescale. This question must be handled carefully. Human-driven environmental change is rapid by human standards. It is also rapid by many ecological standards. But major evolutionary tipping points, as discussed in this book, require time. Not one generation. Not 10 generations. Not even necessarily 1,000 generations. A true FM cascade capable of producing a new body plan may require thousands, tens of thousands, or millions of generations, depending on the organism, the environment, the strength of the signal, and the nature of the developmental change. This is why the future of evolution should not be described as if new body plans will appear tomorrow. The better question is not whether we will soon see entirely new forms of life. The better question is whether current environmental change is beginning to create the conditions under which future lineages may be pushed toward new developmental directions. In that sense, the present may be less like the moment of transformation and more like the beginning of a signal. What we already see. Even now, organisms are responding. Insects evolve resistance to pesticides. Bacteria evolve resistance to antibiotics. Fish populations adapt to polluted water. Some animals alter breeding times in response to climate shifts. Urban birds change song patterns because of noise. Rodents adapt to city environments. Plants shift flowering times. Marine organisms respond to warming, acidification, and oxygen loss. These are not yet evolutionary tipping points in the sense used throughout this book. They are mostly adaptations within existing body plans. But they matter because they show that life is already responding to changed environments. The feedback loop is active. Development, physiology, behavior, and selection are already being reshaped. From the FM perspective, these are early signals. They show that the environment is speaking differently. The question is what happens if those signals continue, intensify, and converge across many generations. The conditions for future cascades. The FM framework predicts that future tipping points would be most likely where several conditions overlap. The 5 conditions for threshold crossing, severe and sustained environmental change, signal convergence, population structure, developmental responsiveness, and latent programs, were laid out in Chapter 5. They apply to the future as much as to the past. Latent programs in a changing world. One implication of FM is that living organisms may carry developmental possibilities that are not currently expressed. These possibilities are not magical. They are inherited developmental pathways, regulatory networks, tissue potentials, metabolic capacities, behavioral tendencies, and structural patterns that may remain silent under stable conditions. In stable environments, many possibilities are unnecessary. They remain buffered, suppressed, or unused. In changed environments, some may become valuable. This is why environmental disruption can be creative for survivors. It can release traits, combinations, and developmental directions that were not useful in the old world but become useful in the new one. The future of evolution may therefore depend not only on what environments destroy, but on what latent possibilities remain in the organisms that survive. This is where modern evolutionary developmental biology becomes important. EvoDevo has shown that many developmental genes and regulatory systems are deeply conserved. Distantly related animals often use related genetic toolkits in different ways. To FM, this matters greatly. It suggests that the raw material for future novelty may already exist. The question is what environmental signals will bring it into expression. Mitochondria and future evolution. Mitochondria may again be central. Modern environmental change often affects exactly the conditions mitochondria respond to: oxygen, nutrients, temperature, toxins, stress, inflammation, and energy demand. Warming affects metabolism. Low oxygen affects energy production. Pollution affects cellular stress. Changed food sources affect nutrient pathways. Urban heat affects physiology. Ocean acidification affects developmental chemistry. Chronic stress affects hormonal and mitochondrial signaling. If mitochondria are environmental translators, then modern environmental change is not only ecological. It is cellular. It enters the energy economy of development. A fish embryo in warmer, lower oxygen water develops under different mitochondrial conditions. A reptile egg incubating in warmer sand develops under different temperature signals. An insect exposed to pesticides develops under different chemical stress. A mammal in an urban environment develops under altered light, food, heat, and stress conditions. These are not yet new body plans, but they are changes in the developmental conversation. And over deep time, conversations repeated often enough can become inheritance. Prediction, not certainty. One of the possible contributions of the FM framework is prediction. Not prediction in the sense of naming the exact animal that will evolve next. Evolution is too complex for that. The future cannot be forecast like a timetable. But FM may help identify where tipping conditions are more likely. Lineages may be more likely to approach a priming threshold when environmental change is severe and sustained, multiple environmental signals converge, populations are small or isolated, developmental systems remain responsive, latent programs exist that can be redirected, and a natural selection preserves the resulting variation. These conditions can be studied. We can measure environmental change. We can monitor population size. We can study developmental sensitivity. We can observe epigenetic response. We can examine mitochondrial stress. We can compare lineages exposed to different levels of environmental change. This does not prove that a tipping point will occur, but it gives us a way to ask better questions. Extinction or transformation. The future of evolution will not be romantic. Many species facing rapid change will not cross a tipping point. They will go extinct. This must be said clearly. Environmental crisis is not a guarantee of creativity. It is often destruction. Most lineages under severe stress disappear. The history of life is full of vanished possibilities. But among the survivors, change may continue. Some lineages may shrink. Some may move. Some may alter reproduction. Some may change behavior. Some may develop new tolerances. Some may become more urban, more nocturnal, more heat tolerant, more pollution tolerant, more flexible in diet or breeding. Most of this will remain adaptation within existing forms. A much smaller number, over much longer spans, may begin moving toward deeper transformation. FM does not ask us to celebrate environmental destruction. It asks us to understand what sustained environmental change does to development, heredity, and evolutionary possibility. Open question. The open question is whether the modern world is creating future FM cascades or merely widespread extinction and short-term adaptation. The answer may not be visible for thousands or millions of years. But the framework changes the question. Instead of asking only, which species will survive, we can also ask, which lineages are receiving the strongest developmental signals? Which populations are small, isolated, and under sustained pressure? Which environments are producing convergent changes in temperature, oxygen, food, chemistry, and stress? Which organisms show early signs of developmental or epigenetic response? Which mitochondrial pathways are being altered by the new world? These questions do not replace conservation biology. They add an evolutionary developmental layer to it. The future of evolution will be shaped by what survives. But it may also be shaped by how the survivors develop in the world we leave behind. Chapter 16. Reflections, a new map of life. Quote, "Behind every adaptation is feedback. Behind every new form is a cascade. And behind every cascade is a conversation between life and its world that has been going on for 4 billion years." Rob Coe, 2026. This book began with a simple idea: life does not merely endure its environment. It listens to it. Not consciously, not intentionally, not as a mind listens, but biologically, chemically, developmentally, and energetically. The environment speaks through oxygen, temperature, light, pressure, food, stress, chemistry, gravity, and ecological relationship. The organism responds through cells, mitochondria, genes, tissues, hormones, behavior, and development. Across one generation, this response may be small. Across many generations, it may become inheritance. Across deep time, it may become form. A different way to see evolution. The standard map of evolution is powerful. Variation arises. Natural selection acts. Successful organisms reproduce. Populations change over time. This remains true. But it may not be complete. The feedback mechanism adds another layer to the map. It asks whether some variation is not purely random in its developmental direction but shaped by environmental signals before selection acts. It asks whether the environment influences not only who survives, but how organisms are prepared for survival. It asks whether development is a passive unfolding of genetic instructions, or an active conversation between inherited possibility and present conditions. This does not discard Darwin. It extends the question Darwin opened. Life as a responsive system. One of the deepest implications of FM is that life may be more responsive than we usually imagine. Organisms are not blank slates. They are not infinitely flexible. They are constrained by genes, ancestry, development, physics, and history. But they are also not sealed machines. They receive signals. They adjust physiology. They alter development. They reallocate energy. They pass on effects. They carry histories of environment in bodies, behaviors, and sometimes inheritance. This responsiveness may be modest in ordinary times. But at tipping points, when the signal becomes severe, sustained, and convergent, responsiveness may become transformation. The Cambrian explosion, the movement from water to land, the origin of flight, the rise of mammals, and the radiations after extinction may all be read in this way, not as random leaps, not as miracles, but as the visible outcome of long environmental conversations. Mitochondria and the deep bridge. At the center of this map are mitochondria. They are ancient. They began as once independent organisms before becoming part of the eukaryotic cell. Their arrival made complex life possible by expanding the energy available to cells. But their importance did not end there. Mitochondria remain responsive to the world. They register oxygen, nutrients, stress, temperature, toxins, and energy demand. They influence gene expression, epigenetic chemistry, metabolism, cellular signaling, and developmental possibility. This makes them one of the deepest bridges in evolution. They connect the environment to the cell. They connect energy to development. They connect ancient history to present adaptation. In the FM framework, mitochondria are not merely powerhouses. They are translators of conditions. They help turn the outside world into internal biological response. If that is true, then the origin of mitochondria was not only one evolutionary tipping point among many. It was the tipping point that made later tipping points possible. The genome as library. Another implication is that the genome may be more like a library than a single script. A script is read from beginning to end. A library contains many possibilities. Not all read at once. The organism does not express every possibility in its genome. Some pathways are active. Others are silent. Some are suppressed. Some appear only under unusual conditions. Some belong to deep ancestry and remain hidden unless development is disturbed or redirected. FM proposes that environmental priming helps determine which parts of the library are read. This is why new forms are never entirely new. A limb grows from a fin-like history. A wing grows from a limb, surface, or appendage. A whale returns to water as a mammal. A bird flies as a dinosaurian descendant. A mammal carries ancient cellular machinery inherited from the origin of eukaryotic life. Evolution does not write on blank paper. It edits, rereads, recombines, and reinterprets. Direction without purpose. One of the most important distinctions in this book is the difference between direction and purpose. FM does not claim that evolution has a goal. It does not claim that organisms know what they are becoming. It does not claim that the environment plans the future. It does not claim that life is guided by intention. But evolution can still be directional. A river has direction without intention. A tree grows toward light without planning. A developing embryo follows gradients and signals without conscious design. In the same way, environmental priming may bias development toward forms that are more suited to the conditions being experienced. That is direction, not purpose. The Cambrian explosion was not planned. The fish-to-land transition was not planned. Flight was not planned. Mammals did not know they were waiting for an asteroid. Dinosaurs did not choose their vulnerability. But in each case, physical and biological signals shaped what became possible. Evolution may be blind in the sense of having no conscious aim. But it may not be as directionless as pure randomness suggests. A new map of life. The old map of evolution is not wrong. But perhaps it is incomplete. It shows mutation and selection. It shows branching descent. It shows adaptation and survival. It shows the tree of life. The new map proposed here adds another layer. It adds the developmental layer, the environment entering organisms before birth, mitochondria translating conditions into energy, latent programs waiting within inherited form, and tipping points where ordinary adaptation becomes transformation. The scientific frontier. FM is not a finished theory. It is an invitation. It invites biologists to look more closely at development, inheritance, energy, and environment as parts of one process. It invites paleontologists to ask whether fossil gaps and bursts correspond to developmental thresholds. It invites evolutionary biologists to test whether environmental signals can produce coordinated variation across generations. It invites mitochondrial biology to become more central to evolutionary theory. Some parts of FM may be wrong. Some may need revision. Some may turn out to be better explained by existing frameworks. That is how theories should be treated. The value of a theory is not that it ends questioning, but that it creates better questions. Final reflection. The history of life is not a straight line. It is not a ladder. It is not a random scatter of accidents. Rather, it is a branching, responsive, energy-driven conversation between organisms and the worlds that shape them. For billions of years, life has been listening to oceans, light, oxygen, darkness, temperature, pressure, food, danger, opportunity, and catastrophe. Sometimes the response is small. Sometimes it disappears. Sometimes it becomes a trait. Sometimes it becomes a lineage. And sometimes, when the signal is strong enough and the threshold is crossed, it becomes a new way of being alive. That is the feedback mechanism of evolution. That is the FM cascade. And that is the map of life this book leaves behind. Final words. Across 3 books, we have traced a journey. The first book asked whether evolution is really driven by randomness alone. It introduced the feedback mechanism as a proposal that it is not, that organisms are shaped not only after birth by selection, but also before birth, before hatching, and during development, through signals from the world around them. The second book asked what principles might sit behind that mechanism. It explored fractal complexity, coevolution of traits, environmental priming, energy allocation, epigenetics, and the role of mitochondria as environmental translators. It applied those ideas to real evolutionary puzzles: the giraffe's neck, the panda's thumb, the blind mole, the giant leaf insect, and the Cambrian explosion. This third book has asked the largest question of the series: how might the feedback mechanism help explain the great leaps of evolution? The answer this book has proposed is the FM cascade, that sustained environmental change, translated through development and energy allocation across generations, may redirect the arc of a lineage toward genuinely new form. Whether that account proves correct, partially correct, or in need of revision, I leave to biology and time. But I believe the central intuition is worth pursuing. Life is not passive. Life listens. Life responds. Life translates the world into form. At the deepest level, evolution is not only a contest between organisms and environments. It is a conversation between them, carried through cells, signals, mitochondria, development, selection, and time. Sometimes that conversation produces small adjustments. Sometimes it produces new traits. Sometimes, after long preparation, it crosses a threshold. And when it does, life does not merely survive the world. It becomes something new within it. Rob Coe, 2026. Acknowledgements. This book is the third in a conversation that has been building across several years of reading, writing, thinking, and questioning. The ideas developed here draw on the work of many scientists and thinkers: Charles Darwin, John Baptiste Lamarck, Stephen Jay Gould, Niles Eldredge, C.H. Waddington, and the many researchers in epigenetics, Evo-Devo, developmental biology, mitochondrial biology, paleontology, and evolutionary theory whose work has made this kind of framework possible. Stephen Jay Gould deserves special mention. His work helped make evolution feel alive to me at an early age. His ability to take the deep puzzles of life and make them urgent, readable, and intellectually exciting has remained a lasting influence. The theory of punctuated equilibrium, developed with Niles Eldredge, is one of the important foundations beneath this book's argument. I am also grateful to the researchers whose work has expanded our understanding of mitochondria. The more we learn about them, the less they look like simple powerhouses and the more they look like responsive biological systems, ancient, sensitive, and deeply connected to the way life reads its environment. To the readers of the first two books, thank you. In many ways, this book exists because of one question that kept returning. If the feedback mechanism is real, how could it produce new body forms? This book is my attempt to answer that question. And finally, to life itself, 4 billion years of experiment, persistence, responsiveness, and form. No plan, no intention, no rest, only the continuous exchange between organism and world. The more closely we look, the more there is to see.